She had spent 15 years building an empire, and 30 seconds watching it mean nothing. The man took one look at her across the candlelit restaurant, and his smile simply died. No apology, no explanation. Just a muttered excuse and the sound of expensive shoes retreating toward the door, leaving Brielle Mercer alone at a table set for two, with a glass of wine she hadn't touched, and a room full of strangers suddenly finding their own plates very interesting. She reached for her purse. Then she heard it. One word, low and quiet from the table beside her, spoken not with pity, but with the steady certainty of someone who meant every syllable. Stay. If you've ever been told, Wishul, without a single word, that you weren't enough, then this story is for you. Watch until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came in sideways off Lake Michigan, the way it always did in October, like the city itself had decided to be difficult. Brielle Mercer stood outside Aurelius, the kind of restaurant where the menus had no prices and the waitstaff called you by name even on your first visit, and spent 45 seconds longer than she should have staring at her own reflection in the dark glass of the door. She looked fine. She knew she looked fine. Fine wasn't the problem. The problem was that she'd done this 4 times in the past 2 years. 4 blind dates arranged by people who loved her and meant well, and somehow couldn't understand that their good intentions had a way of turning into little disasters she had to survive alone in the back of a rideshare home. The problem was that she'd worn the green dress, the one her college roommate Maya had picked out last spring, draping it over Brielle's shoulders and saying, "You look like someone who belongs somewhere important." And now, standing in the rain, the green dress felt like a costume for a play nobody had bothered to rehearse. She pulled the door open and went in. The hostess smiled at her with genuine warmth. "Reservation for Mercer?" "Yes, 2 people." Brielle paused. "He might not be here yet." "He's not, but your table's ready whenever you are." The hostess, young, probably 22, with the kind of effortless confidence Brielle remembered envying at that age, led her through the restaurant. Aurelius was warm and amber-lit, the kind of warm that made everyone look slightly better than they actually were. Low music underneath the murmur of conversation, white tablecloths, rain streaking the floor-to-ceiling windows that faced Michigan Avenue. They seated her by the window. Of course they did. She'd requested it. Brielle settled into her chair, ordered a sparkling water from a passing waiter, and opened her phone. She had 47 unread emails, 3 texts from her CFO about the Kendrick Partners proposal, and a voice message from her mother that she was saving for a moment when she had the emotional bandwidth to survive it. She put the phone face down on the table. Around her, the restaurant moved in that particular Friday night rhythm. Couples leaning close, a group of women in the corner celebrating something, 2 men in suits at the bar who were almost certainly arguing about money. A man at the table closest to her was eating alone, quietly, with the practiced comfort of someone who didn't find solitude uncomfortable. He had a glass of water and a book open beside his plate, though she noticed he wasn't really reading it. He was watching his daughter color something on a paper placemat, leaning occasionally to look at what she was drawing with the focused seriousness of someone whose attention she held absolutely. Brielle looked away. She checked her phone again. Marcus Chen, mutual friend of 2 of her board members, described as thoughtful, funny, works in architecture, super successful, and honestly, Brie, just meet him, was running 8 minutes late. She told herself 8 minutes was nothing. She ordered a glass of wine she didn't particularly want. She thought about the last time, the time before that. The pattern she kept telling herself wasn't a pattern. At 22, she'd built the first version of ClearPath from her apartment with $12,000, a secondhand laptop, and a whiteboard she'd found on the curb. By 26, the company had 40 employees and its first institutional investor. By 28, she'd turned down an acquisition offer from a firm that had laughed at her pitch 3 years earlier. She was 30 now, and ClearPath was valued at somewhere north of $800 million, and she employed over 300 people, and she had never once in her professional life sat across a table from someone and felt like she was in the wrong room. She was exceptional at being the smartest person in a meeting. She was terrible at being a woman waiting for a date. The wine arrived. She sipped it and watched the rain on the glass. Marcus Chen walked in at 7:22. She recognized him from his photo. Tall, dark-haired, the kind of handsome that photographed well and translated even better in person. He was scanning the room with the relaxed authority of someone accustomed to entering places and being looked at. The hostess pointed toward Brielle's table. He turned. She watched him see her. There was a moment, brief, barely 2 seconds, where his face did something she'd seen before. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a grimace or an obvious recoil. It was something much quieter and much worse. The slight recalibration of expectation, the almost imperceptible way his shoulders rearranged themselves, the smile that arrived half a second too late and landed about 15% short of genuine. Brielle had been cataloging that expression since she was 14 years old. She knew every variation of it. He walked toward her anyway. She'll give him that. He actually walked the full distance to her table, which put him ahead of one previous candidate. He stopped 2 feet away, hand resting on the back of the empty chair across from her, not pulling it out. "Brielle," he said. "Marcus." She smiled. She was good at smiling. "Hey, I'm so sorry." He was already looking somewhere else, not at her, past her, the practiced performance of someone whose mind was already composing the exit. "I completely forgot. My colleague just texted. We have a deadline thing, and He exhaled. "I'm really sorry. Tonight isn't going to work." He said it like it was a scheduling conflict, like she was a meeting he was rescheduling rather than a person he was looking at. "Of course," she said. Her voice came out perfectly level. She hated that it came out perfectly level, because levelness had taken her years to learn, and she'd learned it for precisely this kind of moment, and she hated that these moments still existed. "No problem." He nodded once, gave her the ghost of an apologetic look, and left. The whole thing had taken maybe 40 seconds. Brielle picked up her wine glass and set it back down without drinking. She was aware, distantly, the way you're aware of background noise, that the couple at the nearest table had stopped talking, that a woman 2 tables over was looking at her phone with a little too much focus, that the room had done that awful, collective, half-conscious thing where everyone simultaneously knows something happened and simultaneously pretends they don't. She reached for her purse. She was going to leave. She was going to get her coat, walk out into the rain, text Maya something vague about it not clicking, spend the cab ride home reminding herself that she was fine, that it didn't matter, that she'd survived this before and she'd survive it again, and by Monday morning she'd have closed the Kendrick Partners deal and she would not have thought about this once. She was reaching for her coat when she heard it, low, unhurried. From the table immediately beside her, close enough that she'd have caught it, even if she'd been trying not to listen. "Stay, ciao." She turned her head. The man from the adjacent table was looking at her. He was maybe 30, 32. Difficult to read precisely, with the kind of face that looked like it had been through something and come out on the other side not quite undamaged but intact. Dark hair that needed a trim. A blue button-down that was clean but not pressed. He was holding his water glass loosely and looking at her with an expression that was not pity, which was the first thing she checked for, and not the particular practiced sympathy that people aimed at you when they wanted to feel good about themselves. He looked like he just meant it. "You don't have to go," he said. He said it quietly enough that only she could hear it. "You just got your wine." Brielle stared at him. "You were watching." "Not on purpose." He glanced briefly at his daughter, who was still coloring, entirely absorbed. "Sadie, when she concentrates, she makes this face." He demonstrated briefly, scrunching his nose. "It's right in my eye line. I wasn't trying to listen." "But you did." "Yeah." He didn't apologize for it. "I did." Brielle looked down at her wine, then at her purse, then at the door Marcus Chen had just walked out of. The rain on the window had picked up. Outside, people moved quickly under umbrellas, huddled against the cold, and the city lights blurred soft and watercolor through the wet glass. She sat back down. She wasn't sure why. She would spend a fair amount of time over the following weeks being unable to articulate why exactly she'd sat back down, except that the alternative was going home to an empty apartment and an inbox full of things she was excellent at, and the word he'd said had landed somewhere in her chest and just stayed there, like he'd meant it to. "Can I ask you something?" the man said, still from his own table. You can try, said Brielle. Is it the kind of question I'll regret? He said it easily, with a small, crooked half smile that she noticed because it was so unlike the smile Marcus Chen had performed at her 30 seconds ago. This one didn't appear to be working for anything. What's the question? Would it bother you if I pulled this? He gestured at his chair, at the distance between their tables, which was genuinely minimal, 2 feet at most. Would it bother you if Sadie and I relocated? She's got about 3 more minutes before the coloring gets boring, and then I'll be doing the thing where I improvise entertainment. Brielle looked at the little girl. 8, maybe. She had her father's eyes, dark and direct, but her attention was currently devoted entirely to what appeared to be a drawing of a horse. The horse had 7 legs. She's drawing a horse, Brielle said. Yeah, she's in a phase where she thinks extra legs equals extra good. He said it with the flat, exhausted affection of someone who had long since stopped having opinions about the number of legs a fictional horse was allowed to possess. Brielle, she said. She wasn't entirely sure why she said it. She wasn't extending an invitation exactly. Or maybe she was. Nolan, he said. He picked up his water glass, his book, his daughter's crayon pack, and without any particular ceremony, moved his chair the 2 feet it needed to travel, so that they were no longer 2 separate islands in the same amber-lit restaurant. Sadie looked up, assessed Brielle in one quick glance, and went back to the horse. She's not unfriendly, Nolan said. She's just finishing. It's a good horse, Brielle said. It has 7 legs, Sadie said without looking up. I noticed that. That's because it's faster than regular horses. Brielle paused. That's actually a very sound theory. Sadie looked up then, briefly, and gave her a look that suggested she'd been waiting for someone to acknowledge this. Then she went back to coloring. The thing about Nolan Hart, the thing Brielle would notice only gradually, the way you notice something has changed in a room without being able to immediately name what, was that he never once looked at her the way people usually looked at her. He didn't do the thing where he was careful. That studied, deliberate avoidance of noticing anything below her face, that particular performance of casualness that was itself a kind of judgment, the effort loudly demonstrating what someone was working hard not to say. She'd been reading that performance for 15 years, and she was fluent in it. He just talked to her, like she was a person he was talking to. What do you do? He asked, because it was a normal thing to ask in Chicago on a Friday night, and he asked it the way people ask it when they actually want to know. Tech, she said. She left it at that, by habit. She'd learned to measure out the professional information in layers, because people's responses to the word billionaire were rarely useful. Software company. We work on accessible healthcare navigation. You? Currently? He thought about it. I install things. HVAC systems, mostly. I also do some general contracting on the side, weekends. He said it without any of the apologetic hedging she'd encountered from men who felt the need to manage how their jobs were received. Before that, I did structural engineering, but the company folded. I've been meaning to get back to it. What happened to the company? Bad timing, mostly. Pandemic hit when we were mid-expansion. A lot of companies folded. He shrugged. I landed on my feet. You went from structural engineering to HVAC installation. I went from a salary with benefits to 3 different jobs with flexible hours. He looked at Sadie briefly. Which matters more than the title? Brielle turned that over. She was accustomed to men who worked hard to impress her professionally, who escalated their credentials in real time when they sensed her own weight in the room. Nolan said it like a simple fact. What matters more than the title? As if he'd resolved something years ago and no longer needed to explain it. Who's watching Sadie usually on Fridays? Brielle asked. My neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, she had her daughter visiting tonight, so he gestured at the situation. Date night became dinner night. She likes the bread here. It's good bread, Brielle admitted. The best bread, Sadie said, still without looking up. See, said Nolan, she has opinions about bread. They talked for 2 hours. This was the part Brielle would struggle to explain later because she didn't have a framework for it. She had frameworks for negotiation, for due diligence, for reading a room and calibrating her position within it. She had a framework for surviving a bad date with minimal collateral damage. She did not have a framework for sitting in an expensive restaurant next to a structural engineer turned HVAC installer and his daughter eating bread she hadn't ordered and finding herself completely without armor. He asked her about her company in a way that suggested he was actually interested in the answer, which meant the conversation went somewhere other than the generic admiration she usually deflected. He asked specifically about the healthcare navigation model. How did the algorithm account for rural access disparities? Had she considered the gap between digital literacy and platform usability among older demographics? That's a very specific question, Brielle said. My wife was sick for 2 years before she died, Nolan said. He said it plainly, not like a card he was playing. Navigating the insurance system, the specialist referrals, the out-of-network situations, it was a second job. Harder than the first one. I've thought about it a lot. Brielle was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. It was 4 years ago. He looked at Sadie, who had by now moved on from the horse and appeared to be drawing something that might have been a city. We're okay. How old was she? Sadie? 4. He paused. She remembers her mom. Not everything, but she remembers. I'm glad she remembers. There was nothing to add to that, so Brielle didn't add anything. She'd spent years in rooms where silence was weakness, and every gap was an opportunity someone else would fill. She let this one sit. Your family's the kind of healthcare navigation client I actually built the platform for, she said finally. Young families, working people, people who are managing something enormous while also managing everything else. You built it for us and then priced us out of it? She almost choked on her wine. That's fair. We're working on a tiered access model. Good, he said. Because the people who need it most are the ones who can least afford the premium tier. I know. She looked at him. That's why I'm building the tiered model. I know, he said. I believe you. She realized sitting there that she believed that he believed her, which shouldn't have felt like anything in particular, except that it did. Sadie fell asleep in her chair around 9, which Nolan handled with the practiced efficiency of a parent who had stopped finding this embarrassing. He simply relocated her into his lap, tucking her against his shoulder, and continued the conversation with one hand resting on her back. She does this, he said. She fights it until she loses. She's stubborn, Brielle said. Extremely. Gets it from somewhere. He smiled at that. My late wife, actually. Sadie has her eyes and her stubbornness. I can't complain. Both were good on her mother, too. What was her name? Elena. He said it easily, without flinching. She was a painter, portraits mostly. The apartment has about 40 of her paintings, and I can't bring myself to take them down, and Sadie doesn't want me to, so they just live there with us. Brielle looked out the window at the rain. That sounds like a home, she said, rather than just a place to sleep. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. That's exactly what it is. The restaurant had thinned considerably by the time Brielle looked up and realized it was close to 10 o'clock. The couple who'd been 2 tables over were gone. The women celebrating had long since moved somewhere louder. The bar area still held a few people, but the room had settled into its quieter, late-evening rhythm. I should let you get her home, Brielle said. Probably. He looked down at Sadie, who hadn't moved. She's going to be insufferable tomorrow morning. She always thinks she wasn't actually asleep. The classic move. Every time. He glanced up. For what it's worth, you don't have to say anything. I'm not saying it because I have to. He waited until she was looking at him. He was an idiot. The guy who left. Whatever his reason was. And I'm sure he had a whole story about it that made sense to him. He was an idiot. And I'm sorry that happened, and I'm glad you stayed. Brielle looked at him steadily. Compliments she'd learned to deflect. Flattery she'd learned to read. Pity she'd learned to end quickly. This wasn't any of those things, which was the difficulty. It was just a man saying something he appeared to simply mean. Why did you say it? She asked. Stay. Why that word? He was quiet for a moment. His hand moved slightly on Sadie's back. Because nobody should have to eat alone after someone treats them that way, he said. And because, I don't know, it seemed like the right word. Sometimes things just do. She nodded slowly. Thank you, she said. For the company. Any time. He said it simply, and she almost asked him if he meant it, but something stopped her. Not doubt, exactly, just the habit of caution, the well-worn reflex of a woman who'd learned not to assume. She left her card on the table. Her business card, the plain one, just her name and the ClearPath logo and her direct email. The card she gave people when she wanted them to be able to reach her without knowing exactly who they were reaching. She put on her coat, said goodnight to the sleeping Sadie, who was dead to the world. Walked to the door. Outside, the rain was still coming down, cold and relentless off the lake, and the city lights were watercolor through the wet air, and Brielle stood on the sidewalk for a moment in it, not hailing a cab right away, just standing in the rain in the green dress on Michigan Avenue, and she thought, he didn't look at me like I wasn't enough. She thought about when the last time was. She couldn't place it immediately, which told her something. She got in the cab. She didn't text Maya something vague. She stared out the window at the wet city moving past, and she thought about the word he'd said, and how he'd said it, and how for the span of 2 hours in an amber-lit restaurant, she had sat at a table and laughed, actually laughed, the unguarded kind, not the social kind, and talked about something real, and not once felt the need to manage how she was being perceived. Stay. She thought, I might want to. The next morning was a Saturday, which meant it was a board prep day. Brielle was at her kitchen island by 7, coffee cooling beside her laptop, working through the Kendrick Partners proposal with the specific, scalpel-focused energy she brought to financials. Her apartment was high on the 41st floor, west-facing, and on a clear morning you could see the entire sprawl of the city from the living room windows. On a gray October morning like this one, the clouds sat low enough to swallow the tops of the taller buildings, and Chicago looked smaller and more contained, like something you could hold. She had 2 missed calls from Maya. She called back. Well? Maya said before Brielle could speak. He left, Brielle said, before he sat down. A long pause. Oh, Brie. I stayed, though. Another pause. What? I stayed. Someone else was there. We talked. Who? Maya's voice had shifted into the particular register of a person whose attention had just sharpened completely. His name is Nolan. He was at the table next to mine with his daughter. His daughter? Brielle? He was there with his kid on a Friday night? His neighbor was unavailable. She paused. It was a good conversation. A good conversation, Maya repeated with the careful tone of someone who knew that Brielle describing something as good meant she was not yet willing to say what she actually thought about it. He asked about the rural access disparity problem in the platform. Was that flirting? No, he was actually asking. So he's smart. He's a structural engineer, currently does HVAC installation. She paused. He has 3 jobs to support his daughter. His wife died 4 years ago. Maya was quiet for a moment. He sounds like a lot. He's a real person, Brielle said, which was a strange thing to say, she knew. He felt like a real person the whole time. You've been talking to real people this whole time, Bri. I know. She stared at the Kendrick proposal. It just doesn't always feel like it. Must be. Nolan texted on Sunday. She knew it was him because she'd given him her card, and the text came from an unknown number, and the text said, Sadie wanted me to tell you that 7 legs is the correct amount. She's been thinking about it. Brielle read it twice. Then she wrote back, tell her I've done additional analysis and I'm prepared to concede the point. 3 minutes passed. Then, she says, obviously. I raised her to be humble. It's an ongoing project. Brielle set her phone down. Then she picked it up and wrote, if you're ever back in the area, I owe you a proper dinner. The bread was good, but I barely touched my actual food. She stared at what she'd written for a moment before she sent it. It was a clean invitation, not asking for anything beyond what it said, giving him room to take it or decline it without making anything awkward. She sent it. He wrote back in under a minute. Tuesday works for me if it works for you. There's a Vietnamese place in Wicker Park that I've been told is the best in the city by a 7-year-old I happen to trust. 8, she wrote. Sadie is 8. She corrects me on this daily, he wrote back. Tuesday at 7? Tuesday at 7, she said. She put her phone down and went back to the Kendrick proposal. But she found herself, somewhere around page 4, thinking about the way he'd said, stay. Not like a rescue, not like he was doing her a favor, just like someone who'd meant it, like the most natural thing in the world. Tuesday was Vietnamese food and 2 hours that became 3. Thursday was coffee in the loop that ran so far over, they were both late getting back to their respective afternoons. The following weekend, Nolan brought Sadie to the Children's Museum, and Brielle met them there somewhat accidentally on purpose, because Maya had pointed out that if Brielle mentioned the museum to Nolan, it was not technically asking for anything, it was merely an exchange of information. Sadie, upon seeing Brielle, said, "Did you know they have a whole thing about bridges?" "I didn't," said Brielle. "My dad knows a lot about bridges," Sadie said, with the proprietary pride of a child presenting her parents' resume to an interested party. "Is that right?" said Brielle. "Structural load distribution," Nolan said, from directly behind his daughter. "The real crowd pleaser at parties." They spent 3 hours at the museum, and Sadie showed Brielle 6 things about bridges and 1 thing about weather patterns. And when they left, Nolan carried Sadie on his back because her feet were tired. And in the parking lot, when Brielle turned to say goodbye, he said quietly, just to her, while Sadie was already asleep against his shoulder, "She likes you." "I like her," Brielle said, which was simple and true. He nodded. He looked at her for a moment in a way that said something he apparently wasn't quite ready to say with words yet. And she didn't push because she was learning that he got there in his own time and that this was not a problem. She drove home thinking about it, though. The tabloids were Maya's fault, technically, not intentionally. Maya had come to the product launch party in the 3rd week of October, a party at ClearPath's West Loop offices, a client showcase, 60-something guests, and at some point during the evening she'd taken a photo that included, in the background, Brielle laughing at something Nolan had just said, and she'd posted it with the caption, "My girl and her people, harmless in isolation." But one of the guests had recognized Brielle, and someone else had recognized that the man in the background was decidedly not the sort of man who typically appeared in photographs beside Brielle Mercer, and by the following morning there were 3 separate posts on 2 different platforms identifying Nolan as the mystery man in Brielle Mercer's orbit. By that afternoon there were comment sections. Brielle read them once, just once, because she was not the kind of person who read comment sections more than once. It took her about 4 minutes. The comments said what she'd known they would say. They said it about her appearance with the casual cruelty of people who believed that the internet made cruelty weightless, consequence-free, their private opinion rather than a public wound. They said it about Nolan with the particular flavor of contempt reserved for men who were perceived to be punching above their financial station. 2 separate accounts asked, with apparent sincerity, what a man like him was getting out of the arrangement. She closed the browser. She sat at her desk for a moment with her hands flat on the wood. Then she went to a 4-hour product strategy meeting and was completely present for all of it, because this was what she'd learned to do. She didn't tell Nolan about it. He found out on his own. One of his coworkers showed him his phone, the way people do, not meaning harm necessarily, but also not entirely not meaning it. And he texted her that evening, "Saw some things online. I'm sorry they're saying that about you." She wrote back, "They say that about me regularly. I'm okay. I know you're okay. I'm still sorry." She stared at that for a while. "Thank you," she wrote finally. "I don't love it, but I've survived worse." "I believe you," he wrote. And then, "Does it bother you?" The attention, with me in it. She thought about how to answer that honestly, and she wrote, "It bothers me that people look for reasons why you would want to be around me that have nothing to do with me. It bothers me that they found you and made you part of it without asking. It doesn't bother me that people know I'm spending time with you." She hit send before she could revise it. He wrote back after a minute, "Good," he said, "because I'm not going anywhere." She read that 3 times. She went to bed thinking about it. She woke up the next morning thinking about it still. The legal thing came out gradually, the way important things often did. Not in one conversation, but in pieces, over the course of several evenings, so that by the time Brielle understood the whole shape of it, she'd already been carrying the parts of it for weeks. Elena's parents, the Vasquez family out of Phoenix, had retained an attorney 6 months after Elena's death and filed for partial custody of Sadie. Their argument was stability. Nolan worked multiple jobs, worked irregular hours, had no extended family support in Chicago, and was raising a child in a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side. They had a house, retirement income, availability. They wanted Sadie for summers and alternating holidays, minimum. Nolan had countered that Sadie was 8 years old and had never lived outside of Chicago, and that disrupting her school year and her friendships, and the only home she'd ever known, was not stability, it was displacement, and that he was her father and she was staying with him. The case had been moving through the courts for 8 months when Brielle found out about it. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because it's—" He stopped. Started again. "It's the kind of thing that changes how people see the whole picture. I didn't want you to look at me and see a legal battle. I'm looking at you and seeing a man who's been carrying this alone." He was quiet for a moment. They were in his kitchen, small, clean, painted a slightly uneven blue that Sadie had helped with. And Sadie was asleep down the hall, and Elena's paintings were on the walls of the living room visible through the doorway, including one portrait that Brielle had looked at for a long time the first time she'd been in this apartment, a woman with dark eyes and a direct, confident gaze, painted as if she knew exactly where she was and had decided it was a good place to be. "The Vasquez family isn't wrong that I've been stretched thin," Nolan said. "They're not bad people. They love Sadie, I believe that." He looked at his hands. "But Sadie needs to be here. She needs her school, her room, her neighborhood, her mom's paintings." He paused. "She needs me." "She does," Brielle said simply. He looked up. "She talks about you constantly," Brielle said. "Not the way kids talk about parents out of obligation. She talks about you the way she talks about things that matter to her. Like the 7-legged horse and the bridges." He exhaled slowly. "The court date is in February." "Okay," Brielle said. "Okay?" She looked at him across the small kitchen table with its slightly uneven legs and its surface marked with the particular wear of years of homework and meals and art projects. "I mean, okay, as in, I know now. You don't have to carry it by yourself anymore." She paused. "I don't mean that as a, I know what you mean," he said. And he did. He looked at her for a moment, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his and left it there. She turned her hand over, held on. October became November. The Kendrick Partners deal closed on a Thursday morning, and Brielle called Maya from the parking garage to say so, and Maya said, "You sound different," in a tone that meant she wasn't talking about the deal. "Different how?" Brielle asked. "Less like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop," Maya said. "You usually sound like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop." Brielle thought about that on the drive home. She thought about the green dress, still hanging in her closet. She thought about the table for two at Aurelius and what she'd been carrying into the restaurant that night. Not just the date, not just the hope, but the older weight underneath it. The 15 years of learning to hold herself in that particular braced way, prepared for the shoe, expecting it, tensed against it. She thought about the word stay and how she'd sat back down. She thought about Nolan's hand covering hers in the blue kitchen. She thought, maybe this is what it feels like when the other shoe doesn't drop. She was careful with that thought. She'd been careful her whole life, but she kept it. The first time he told her she was beautiful, he said it by accident. Or not by accident. He said it in the middle of a sentence, in passing, the way you might mention a fact you'd assumed was already established. And when she went very still, he registered it and said, "Did that? Don't take it back," she said. He looked at her. "Don't explain it away or walk it back," she said. "If you meant it, leave it there." He held her gaze steadily. "I meant it." She nodded. Something in her chest, something she'd been holding in a certain careful position for a very long time, shifted slightly. "Okay," she said. Her voice came out less even than usual. She cleared her throat. "Okay." He didn't make it into more than it was. He just let it settle. The way he let most things settle. With the particular patience of a man who had learned, at some point, that the things worth saying didn't need to be performed, they just needed to be said. By late November, the tabloids had graduated from vague curiosity to the kind of pointed speculation that arrived with screenshots and comparison photos and comment sections full of people who had strong opinions about a woman they'd never met. Brielle read them less and less, not because they hurt less, because she'd gotten better over these weeks at choosing what to carry. She was still learning it. She got it wrong sometimes. Some morning she woke up with the weight of what people said sitting right at the front of her chest, and she had to actively decide to put it somewhere that wasn't the center of her day. She was learning to put it down. She was learning slowly that the place she came back to steadiest wasn't her corner office or her product roadmap or the number in her company's valuation. It was a small apartment on the north side with uneven blue walls and paintings that watched you from every room, and a little girl who had seven-legged theories and a father who said things like he meant them. It was a word whispered in a restaurant on a rain-soaked Friday night. It was the simple, unremarkable, completely extraordinary fact of someone who had looked at her, not her company, not her body, not her number, and decided she was worth staying for. She was learning what to do with that. She was finding, the hardest and most necessary thing she'd ever learned. The December charity gala invitation arrived in Brielle's inbox on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between a vendor contract and a message from her CFO about Q4 projections. She almost missed it. The Meridian Foundation Gala, annual, black tie, held at the Chicago Cultural Center, attended by the kind of people who wrote checks large enough to rename hospital wings. Brielle had attended 4 of the previous 5. She'd skipped 1 year because the timing conflicted with a Series B close, and 3 board members had told her, separately, that her absence had been noticed, the kind of notice that carried a mild warning inside it. She RSVP'd yes, 1 guest. Then she stared at the guest field for a moment and changed it to 2. She closed the laptop before she could change it back. She told Nolan about it that Thursday evening in the way she'd started telling him things. Not building up to it, not managing his response in advance, just saying it while they were doing something else, while the moment was still ordinary. They were in his kitchen again. Sadie was doing homework at the table with the focused intensity she brought to things she found interesting and the dramatic suffering she brought to things she didn't. Currently, long division. Currently, dramatic suffering. "There's a gala," Brielle said. She was standing at the counter, her coat still half on, holding a container of soup she'd brought because Nolan had mentioned that morning that he'd been too slammed between jobs to get groceries. "December 14th. It's black tie, it's industry, it's the kind of thing where it matters that I show up, and I want to ask you to come." Nolan looked up from where he was doing something with a cabinet hinge that had been loose since September. He had a screwdriver in one hand and the focused half-attention of a man managing 3 things at once. "Okay," he said. She waited. "That's it?" she said. "Just okay?" "What else would I say?" "I don't know. Most people have questions." "What kind of questions?" "Like, it's formal. It's my professional world. There will be press. There will be people who already have opinions about—" She stopped, gestured vaguely at the general situation. Nolan set the screwdriver down and looked at her directly. "Brielle, I've been to funerals in a rented suit, and I've walked into a courtroom representing myself. A charity gala doesn't scare me." He paused. "Does it scare you?" She opened her mouth, closed it, set the soup down on the counter. "Yes," she said. "Then we'll go scared," he said. "That's not a reason not to go." From the table, without looking up from her long division, Sadie said, 9 goes into 54 6 times, and I think that means the answer is 32. Nolan turned. "Walk me through that." 9 times 6 is 54, and then I— "Start from the top," he said. He picked the screwdriver back up and went back to the hinge, but his attention shifted to Sadie, and Brielle stood in the kitchen holding her coat and watching the ordinary mechanics of this household. The hinge, the homework, the soup she'd brought that nobody had yet acknowledged, but that everyone understood was care in a container. And she felt something in the center of her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple. It was the feeling of being in a room that fit. She hadn't told him about the online comments, not the specific ones, not the volume of them, not the way they'd evolved over November from curious to vicious as the tabloid coverage escalated. She'd told him the shape of it, people are saying things, and he'd said he was sorry, and she'd said she was okay, and that had been true in the way that okay is always true when you're choosing to function in spite of something rather than because it's gone. But the comments were still there, growing in the way internet things grew when they found a nerve. 2 weeks into December, someone had compiled a thread, screenshots, photos, the kind of annotated cruelty that took real effort, and it had gotten 30,000 interactions before Brielle stopped looking at the numbers. Her PR director, a woman named Constance who'd been managing Brielle's public profile for 6 years and had the serene unflappability of someone who had genuinely seen everything, brought it up in their weekly call. "I want to address it directly," Brielle said. "I'd recommend against that," Constance said. "Engagement feeds it. Right now it's tabloid noise. If you respond, it becomes a story. People are saying..." "I know what people are saying." Constance's voice was even and unreadable. "People have been saying things about powerful women since before either of us were born. The question is which platform you want to give it." "None," Brielle said. "Then we don't comment. We let it cycle out." Brielle stared at the ceiling of her office. "And if it doesn't cycle out? Then we reassess." A pause. "Is he worth the noise?" She thought about Nolan in his blue kitchen with the cabinet hinge and the long division. She thought about, "We'll go scared." "Yes," she said. "Then the math is simple," Constance said. "I'll keep monitoring." She was at Nolan's apartment the following Saturday when the custody thing cracked open in a way it hadn't before. She'd arrived to find him on the phone in the hallway, his voice quiet and clipped in the way it got when he was keeping something out of it. Not anger exactly, but the effort to contain anger, which was its own kind of pressure. Sadie was in her room with the door half closed, and through the gap Brielle could see her sitting on the bed with her knees pulled up, which was Sadie's particular posture for when something was wrong and she was being very 8 years old about not showing it. Brielle sat on the couch and waited. He came in after a few minutes, set his phone on the coffee table face down, and stood in the middle of the living room with his hands in his pockets. He looked like a man doing math in his head that wasn't coming out the right way. "The Vasquez family's lawyer filed a motion," he said. "They're arguing that my living situation is unstable because I'm in a relationship that's receiving significant media attention. They're saying it's disruptive to Sadie's home environment." Brielle was very still. "They're using us. They're using the tabloid coverage," he exhaled, "which is not the same thing as Nolan." "I know." He sat down on the arm of the chair across from her. He looked tired in the specific way he looked tired when the legal thing was active, not physically worn but wrung out somewhere deeper, the exhaustion of carrying something heavy over long terrain with no clear end in sight. "I know. I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be sorry. You didn't do anything. I brought the press into your orbit. The press was already watching you." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't ask for that, and neither did I. The Vasquez lawyer is using it because it's available. That's different from it being your fault. Does it matter whose fault it is if it's hurting Sadie's case?" He was quiet for a moment. "My lawyer thinks we can counter it. The argument is thin. There's no evidence of actual disruption, just noise. And noise isn't a custody standard." He paused. "But it's not nothing. It's something they can keep pointing at." Through the half-open door, Brielle could see Sadie sitting very still on her bed. "Can I go talk to her?" Brielle asked. Nolan looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She held his gaze. "Can I?" He nodded. Sadie's room was small and extremely inhabited, drawings everywhere, a shelf of books organized by some system that made sense only to its architect, a model of what appeared to be a very ambitious bridge structure taking up most of the desk. Brielle knocked on the open door and Sadie looked up. "Hey," Brielle said. "Hey." Sadie looked back at her knees. Brielle came in and sat on the edge of the desk chair, which was the only available surface not occupied by either drawings or bridge components. "You okay?" "I heard them," Sadie said. "On the phone. Dad and the lawyer person. Yeah? They want me to go to Phoenix. Her voice was flat. For the whole summer. I know. I don't want to go to Phoenix. I know. Sadie was quiet. She picked at a thread on her sock. My grandparents aren't bad, she said, with the careful fairness of a child who had given this actual thought. They're nice. They send good birthday presents. She paused. But Phoenix is really hot, and my school is here, and my room is here, and her voice hitched just slightly, and she pulled it back. My mom's paintings are here. Brielle sat with that. Your dad is fighting for you, she said finally. Every day. He's not going to stop. I know. Sadie looked up. Her eyes were dry, but her jaw was tight in that Nolan way. I just don't understand why they get to fight over me when I'm right here. Brielle didn't have a good answer to that, because there wasn't one. So she didn't offer one. That's a fair thing to be angry about, she said instead. Sadie looked at her for a moment. Then, with the abrupt gear shift of an 8-year-old who had processed what she needed to process. Can you help me with the bridge? I can't figure out how to make the suspension cables work. I don't know anything about suspension cables, Brielle said. Dad does, but he's sad right now, so I don't want to ask him. Brielle looked at the bridge. She looked at Sadie. Show me what you're trying to do, she said. They worked on the bridge for 45 minutes. Brielle didn't fix anything. She mostly held things while Sadie tried approaches and discarded them and tried again. But somewhere in the middle of it, Nolan appeared in the doorway, watched them for a moment without saying anything, and then quietly came in and sat on the floor and started untangling a length of string that had gotten knotted in the cable mechanism. Nobody said anything about the phone call. Nobody said anything about Phoenix or the Vasquez family or the motion that had been filed. The three of them sat in the small room with its drawings and its bridge and its organized books and untangled the string together, which was not a solution to anything but was, in its own way, the thing that was needed. The gala was December 14th, which gave Brielle 2 weeks to talk herself into it and out of it approximately 6 times. She went. Obviously she went. She'd said she was going. She picked Nolan up at his apartment because the parking situation was cleaner that way, and when she rang the buzzer and he came down, she noticed he'd gotten the suit pressed and done something with his hair that suggested he'd had help. Sadie appeared in the lobby doorway in her pajamas and announced that she had picked the tie, which was navy blue, and was, Sadie informed them, the correct choice because it matched his eyes. My eyes aren't navy, Nolan said. They are in certain lights, Sadie said firmly. I've studied it. Mrs. Okafor is upstairs, Nolan told Brielle. We have until midnight. You look... Brielle started. Don't, he said, but he was smiling. I was going to say you look like someone who got dressed by an 8-year-old with excellent taste. That's exactly what happened, Sadie agreed, satisfied. The Chicago Cultural Center was exactly what it always was. Soaring ceilings, marble floors, the kind of institutional grandeur that made everyone walk slightly differently, more upright, more conscious of themselves. The foundation had taken the Preston Bradley Hall for the evening, and the chandelier light came down through the stained glass dome in amber and gold and made the room look like something from another century. Brielle had been in this room before. She knew its rhythms. She knew the layout of the evening, cocktail hour, dinner, speeches, the auction that nobody loved but that everyone participated in because the foundation's work was real and the money mattered. She knew which of the attendees would seek her out for business and which for social currency and which because they were genuinely glad to see her. She'd navigated this room without difficulty 4 separate times. She'd never navigated it with someone beside her. Nolan took it in without visible performance. He looked at the dome, briefly, the way engineers looked at structural things, not decoratively but with the instinct to understand the load. Then he looked at the room. A lot of money in here, he said. Yes. And they all know each other? Most of them. Some of them wish they knew each other more than they do. She scanned the room. The ones near the bar who look like they're having fun are the ones who actually have money. The ones near the center who look slightly strained are the ones working to get it. He followed her gaze. And where do you fall? Near the windows, she said. I'm always near the windows, easier to breathe. He offered his arm with the ease of someone who was not intimidated by the room, but understood that the room might require navigation. And she took it, and they moved through the cocktail crowd together. It went well, for an hour. She introduced him simply. Nolan Hart, he's an engineer, and the people who mattered asked him the right questions, and he answered them without performing, which was itself a kind of confidence that the room recognized, even if it couldn't name it. She watched a venture capitalist who'd been skeptical of her Series B genuinely engage with Nolan over structural approaches to adaptive building systems, and she thought, he's good at this. He doesn't know he's good at this. The moment came, as these moments always seem to, without announcement. His name was Warren Holt. He was 63, a private equity man with a portfolio that included 3 hospital systems and a self-image the size of the chandelier above him. Brielle had dealt with Warren Holt twice before, once in a board meeting where he'd questioned her growth projections with the particular condescension men of his type reserved for women of her type, and once at an industry conference where he'd tried to acquire her company through a dinner conversation rather than a formal approach. Both times, she'd handled him. Both times, it had cost her more than she showed. He came to them across the room with his glass raised in a greeting, the smile of a man who enjoyed an audience, and 2 associates trailing close enough to signal that this was a performance intended for witnesses. "Brielle," he said, "you look festive." She smiled with the part of her face that was for Warren Holt. "Warren, good to see you." His gaze moved to Nolan with the particular quality of assessment that men like Warren Holt applied to anyone they hadn't already categorized. "And who's this?" "Nolan Hart," Nolan said, and extended his hand before Brielle could introduce him. Warren shook it with the grip-measuring energy of a man who made those calculations. "And what do you do, Nolan?" Warren asked, with the voice of someone asking a question they already don't care about the answer to. "HVAC installation. Some contracting work." Warren's smile shifted in a way that was barely perceptible and also completely legible. He looked from Nolan to Brielle and back, and then he did the thing she'd prepared herself for, and still, despite the preparation, felt like something cold thrown across her chest. "Well," he said to the assembled small audience around him, with the genial, knowing tone of a man making a joke everyone was supposed to be in on, "I always say a successful woman is the most generous employer in any room." One of the associates made a sound that was halfway to a laugh. The room didn't erupt. It wasn't that dramatic. It was a cocktail party moment, a terrible small joke delivered with the comfortable cruelty of a man who'd never had to consider its weight, and it landed in the ambient noise of the evening and absorbed into it, and most people nearby either hadn't quite heard or were deciding they hadn't. A few people near enough to have caught it looked briefly away. Brielle felt it as a sound and also as something physical, somewhere in her sternum, the particular impact of a thing said in public that you can't unhear. She was composing her response. She'd been composing responses to men like Warren Holt for 15 years, and she was good at them, precise and bloodless. When Nolan spoke first. "That's a strange thing to say," Nolan said. He said it simply, in the same even tone he used for everything, not elevated, not aggressive, just stated. At a charity gala. Warren blinked. He hadn't expected to be answered. Men like Warren Holt rarely were. "It was a joke." "I know." Nolan looked at him without looking away. That's what makes it strange. The small silence that followed was approximately 3 seconds long and felt considerably longer. One of Warren's associates had gone carefully neutral. The other was looking at his phone. Warren's smile reassembled itself. "Well," he said, "no offense intended." And he moved on, because men like Warren Holt always moved on. The damage left behind them like something they'd forgotten to pick up. Brielle stood very still. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I know," Nolan said. He wasn't looking at Warren anymore. He was looking at her. "Are you okay?" The standard answer was already forming. She stopped it. "I've heard worse. I know how to handle worse. I had a response ready." "I know you did. I could have." "I know." He held her gaze. His expression was calm and also something else underneath it. A controlled heat, not temper exactly, but the ember of it. I just didn't see why you should have to. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said, and she meant something more than the surface of it, and she thought he understood that, because he nodded once in the particular way that meant he'd received what she'd actually said. Well, dinner was easier. They were seated at a table with the Foundation's director, an environmental nonprofit CEO Brielle liked, and a retired federal judge who turned out to have gone to the same engineering college as Nolan, which produced 45 minutes of conversation about concrete tensile properties that Brielle followed about 30% of and found she didn't mind not following. She watched Nolan talk across the table. He leaned forward when the topic engaged him, leaned back when he was listening. He had a way of being still that wasn't passive. It was the stillness of someone paying attention, someone who didn't need to fill silence with the sound of themselves. The retired judge was gesturing at something with her bread roll, and Nolan was nodding and asking a follow-up question and laughing at something she said. A real laugh, and Brielle thought, he's never once tried to be impressive. He just is. She thought about Warren Holt's face when Nolan had answered him back. She thought about the 3 seconds of silence. She thought about what it felt like to have someone decide, without calculation, without asking if she needed it, that she shouldn't have to carry the next 30 seconds alone. She wasn't sure the last time someone had done that. She might not have let them. They were in the car heading back north when it came apart. Not between them, within her. The evening had gone well enough, the Warren Holt moment a bruise rather than a break, and she'd handled the rest of it with the competence she always brought to these rooms. But it was late now, and the city lights were moving past the car windows in the way they did this late, slower and quieter. And the effort she'd been holding the whole evening started to cost her in a way she hadn't prepared for. She was quiet for too long, and Nolan, who had a calibrated awareness of the difference between comfortable silence and the kind that needed attention, said, "Talk to me. I'm okay. I know you are." A beat. "Talk to me anyway." She watched the lights for a moment. "I've been going to events like that for 8 years. By myself. I know exactly how to walk into those rooms and who to talk to and how to manage it." She paused. "Tonight was the first time I walked in with someone, and I spent the entire evening aware of it. Every second, every conversation, every person who looked at us." She exhaled. "That's exhausting in a way I didn't anticipate." He was quiet, letting her finish. "And the worst part," she said, "is that I don't know how much of it is them and how much of it is me. How much of what I was watching for is real, and how much is just me expecting it, because I always expect it." She looked at him. "That's the part I can't untangle." "Warren Holt was real," Nolan said. "Warren Holt is always real." She shook her head slightly. "But not everyone is Warren Holt, and sometimes I treat rooms like they're full of him. She stopped. "That's mine to fix." He glanced at her briefly, his eyes on the road. "Can I say something without you deciding it's pity?" "You can try." "What you just said, knowing it's yours to fix, naming it out loud, that's not a small thing. Most people don't get there." He paused. "I'm not saying the work isn't hard. I'm saying you're already doing it." She was quiet for a moment. "When Elena was sick," she said. She'd learned to say Elena's name without prefacing it, which had taken longer than she'd have liked. Did she ever talk about feeling like she was being looked at? Like people couldn't see past the illness to her? He was quiet for a moment, and she heard him decide to answer honestly rather than simply. "All the time," he said. She called it being swallowed by the label, like the label was visible and she was behind it. He shifted his grip on the wheel. She figured out, eventually, that the people worth keeping were the ones who kept looking past the label, who could hold both things at once, the illness and her. "That's a short list," Brielle said. "It is," he said. "It's supposed to be." She looked at the city through the window. "You're on my list," she said. He didn't make it into anything. He just said, "Good." And then after a moment, "You're on mine." They sat outside his building for a few minutes after he parked. Neither of them moved to get out. It wasn't planned. It was the particular gravity of a conversation that hadn't finished moving yet, that needed the extra time to settle. "The custody motion," Brielle said finally. "The one about the media attention." Yeah. Do you want me to? She stopped, started again. I don't want to make it worse. I need you to tell me if I'm making it worse. He turned to look at her directly. You're not. I could be. If the coverage... Brielle. His voice was even. My lawyer is handling it. The argument is thin and he knows it. And the alternative... He stopped. Something crossed his face that she was learning to read, the brief appearance of what he was carrying before he rearranged it into something manageable. The alternative to this isn't easier. The alternative to this is not having it, and I'm not willing to not have it. She held that. Okay, she said. Okay, he agreed. She got out of the car. He walked her to the rideshare she'd called, the way he always did, waiting with her on the sidewalk in the December cold. When the car arrived, she turned to say goodnight, and he was closer than she'd expected, which wasn't an accident. The gala went fine, he said. It did. And the next one will go fine too. She looked at him. There doesn't have to be a next one. I know you don't need it. His voice was quiet. But I'm going to be there, because that's where you are. He held her gaze. That's not negotiable. She was aware of the cold and the street and the rideshare idling at the curb. She was aware of 15 years of walls built with good reason and the specific texture of this moment pressing against them. She reached up and touched his jaw. Brief. Just a second. Then she got in the car. Through the window, she watched him stand on the sidewalk until the car turned the corner, arms in his coat pockets. Not performing patience, just having it. She pressed her head back against the seat. The gala had gone fine. Warren Holt had said something awful, and Nolan had answered it quietly, and the evening had moved on the way evenings did. And she was sitting in a car heading home, not empty in the way she usually was after these events, not armoring up for the debrief she always had with herself on the way back. She was thinking about 3 seconds of silence after a man like Warren Holt said something like that, and the person beside her who had decided, plainly, simply, that she shouldn't have to stand there alone in it. She was thinking that she was not accustomed to not being alone in it. She was thinking, carefully, about what she might do with that. The week after the gala, Brielle woke up 3 mornings in a row thinking about Warren Holt's face. Not the words. She'd heard versions of those words before, had built an entire internal infrastructure for processing them and moving on. It was the face. The particular ease of it, the way he'd smiled while he said it, like he was doing everyone a favor by saying the quiet part loud, like it was generous, somehow, to name what everyone was already thinking. She got up each morning and ran the numbers on the Kendrick deal and answered 40 emails before 8 and was in the office by 9 and was good at every single thing she did. She was excellent at her job. She had been excellent at her job for 8 years, and she was not going to stop being excellent because a man with bad politics and good tailoring had aimed something at her at a cocktail party. On the 4th morning, she called her therapist, Dr. Carol Watkins, and said she needed to move their January appointment to December. How soon? Carol asked. Soon. They met that Thursday. Carol's office was in Lincoln Park, 2nd floor, with a window that looked out over a small garden that was currently dormant and gray and somehow still calming. Brielle sat in the chair she always sat in and described the gala and Warren Holt and the 3 seconds of silence and then Nolan answering him back, and Carol listened with the particular quality of attention that Brielle had been paying for, on and off, for 6 years. When Brielle finished, Carol said, "What are you most afraid of right now?" Brielle thought about it honestly. That I'm going to hurt him, or Sadie, without meaning to. How? By... She stopped. By being what I am, visible, attached to a noise machine that I didn't build and can't completely turn off. She paused. The custody motion used the media coverage. His lawyers are handling it, but the fact that it's usable as an argument at all, is that the fear, or is that the reason for the fear? Brielle looked at the gray garden. Both. What's underneath it? A long pause. That people are right, she said finally. Not about him wanting my money. That's absurd. Anyone who spent 5 minutes with Nolan knows that's absurd. But about the broader thing, that he'd be better off with someone who doesn't bring all this. She exhaled. That the judgment is a consequence of me, specifically. and that people who are near me absorb it. Carol nodded slowly. You've carried that thought for a while. I've carried it my whole life. And Nolan, what has he told you about that thought? That it's wrong. Do you believe him? Brielle was quiet for a moment. I believe he means it. That's different from believing him. I know, she said. She didn't tell Nolan about the therapy appointment, not because she was hiding it. She'd mentioned Carol before, the way you mention the structures that keep you functional, but because the specific content of that particular session felt like something she needed to carry privately for a while, the way you sometimes needed to decide something alone before you could say it out loud. What she did instead was work. December was always heavy at ClearPath. Year-end reporting, board prep, the fourth quarter push that she'd built the company's annual rhythm around. She put in 12-hour days, which wasn't unusual, and came home to her apartment on the 41st floor and ate whatever was in the kitchen and answered the last of the day's emails and thought about the gala and the garden and the answer she hadn't been able to give Carol yet. Nolan texted her regularly, not with the anxious frequency of someone monitoring distance, but with the easy consistency of someone who thought of her during his day and said so. A photo of a particularly chaotic HVAC installation with the caption, 3 years of engineering education for this. A voice message from Sadie about a book she thought Brielle should read, delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who did not consider her recommendation optional. A late-night text, twice. Still up? And when she said yes, a short call. 15 minutes, 20, nothing important. Just the particular comfort of hearing someone's voice when the apartment was quiet and the city was dark outside the windows. She was aware that she was leaning on it. She tried to be careful about leaning too hard. She was not, she understood, particularly good at being careful about this. She was good at holding people at distance. Letting someone in and then calibrating the lean, that was different, harder, required a skill she was still building. Boutet. Christmas came and went. Brielle flew to D.C. to spend 4 days with her parents and her younger brother Terrell, who had a way of reading her with the irritating accuracy of siblings who'd spent their childhoods paying attention. On the third day, over coffee in their mother's kitchen, Terrell said, "You're different." Different how? Less like someone waiting to get this over with. He said it with the blunt affection that was his primary mode. "Mom said you mentioned someone." "I mention people." "You don't, actually." She looked at her coffee. "His name is Nolan. It's still early." "How early?" 2 months. Terrell looked at her for a moment. And he's good." She paused. "He's not like—" She stopped, because the sentence was going somewhere she hadn't planned, and she took a breath and let it go somewhere honest anyway. "He's not like the versions I was used to. The ones where I either had to be smaller so they weren't threatened, or I had to manage how they saw me, or—" She stopped again. "With him, I talked to him, like a person." Terrell was quiet for a second. Then, "That's the bar? That he talks to you like a person?" "You'd be surprised how high that bar actually is." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he put his coffee down and said carefully, "Are you letting him in? Actually in?" She looked at him. "I'm trying." "Good." He picked his coffee back up. "Because you've been keeping everyone at approximately arm's length since grad school, and it's been exhausting to watch from the outside." "I haven't been?" "Brie." She stopped. "Okay," she said. "Maybe." He smiled at that. He had their mother's smile. "Tell me about him," he said. And so she did, sitting in their mother's kitchen in December, and it felt surprisingly uncomplicated. Natural, even. The way things felt when you'd been carrying them alone and finally said them to someone who could hold them without needing to do anything particular with them. She was back in Chicago for New Year's. She spent it with Maya and a group of people at a rooftop bar in River North, and at midnight she stood in the cold and watched the fireworks over the lake and texted Nolan. "Happy New Year." He wrote back, "Happy New Year. Sadie is asleep wearing a paper crown she made at 11:47, and I'm calling that close enough." She smiled at her phone in the cold. "That's a successful celebration," she wrote. She says 2025 is going to be the best year for bridge engineering, he wrote. She's very confident. Tell her I'll invest, Brielle wrote. She says she accepts, he wrote. And then, I'm glad you stayed, Brielle. She read that twice. She looked at the city below. The lights on the water, the cold, clear sky, the particular feeling of a year tipping into the next. And she thought about the restaurant in October and the word that had stopped her at the door, and how much had changed in the space between that moment and this one. She typed, "So am I." She meant it all the way down. January arrived with the specific Chicago brutality that tourists never believed until they experienced it. Wind that cut sideways off the lake and made 30 degrees feel like 10. Gray skies that settled in for weeks at a time, the city operating in a kind of collective stoic endurance. Brielle didn't mind winter. She found it clarifying. The cold stripped everything back to what was necessary. What was necessary, it turned out, was more than she'd expected. The board meeting was January 19th, 12 people in the ClearPath conference room, investors, independent directors, her executive team. Standard quarterly. She'd run 40 of these and could manage them in her sleep. She walked in with her materials prepared, her talking points ordered, her read of the room complete before she'd set her laptop down. The agenda shifted in the third hour. It shifted because of Warren Holt, which she should have anticipated and somehow hadn't, or had partially, in the back of her mind, the way you anticipated bad weather you were hoping would track somewhere else. Warren Holt was not on her board. He'd never been on her board, she'd been specific about that from the start. But he had a relationship with two of her independent directors, a relationship built over years and dinners, and the particular social architecture of Chicago's finance world. And somewhere between the gala in December and the January 19th meeting, he had apparently said things. She learned this because Daniel Foss, independent director, generally reliable, good questions, 12 years on the board, said toward the end of the third hour that he'd received some questions from stakeholders about strategic focus given the company's recent public profile. Strategic focus, Brielle said. The coverage, Daniel said carefully. The personal coverage. Some stakeholders have expressed concern that the narrative may be distracting from what exactly? Her voice was even. She'd learned the voice from years of needing it. From ClearPath's institutional positioning. He looked at his materials rather than at her. The tabloid attention specifically. Some of our institutional investors prefer a lower profile environment. Around the table, she read faces. Her CFO, Marcus Tang, was expressionless in the way he was when he was angry about something and containing it. Her head of product was looking at the wall. Two of the independent directors were nodding in the careful way of people who'd decided in advance to agree. The third independent director, a woman named Patricia Ewan, who'd been on the board since Series B, was watching Brielle with the sharp, attentive expression of someone waiting to see what happened next. Brielle took a breath. She thought about Carol's office and the gray garden and the question she hadn't answered yet. Daniel, she said, I want to understand this clearly. Are we discussing a business concern or a personal one? They're not, when institutional perception is, they're separate things, she said. I want to know which one we're discussing. She waited. Because if we're discussing a business concern, if there is a specific demonstrable impact on our institutional relationships, I want to see the data. I want names. I want the conversations documented. I want to understand the actual scope. She looked around the table. If we're discussing someone's personal discomfort with who I spend my time with, that's a different meeting, and it's one I'm not prepared to have. Patricia Ewan, at the far end of the table, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Daniel looked at his materials. I simply wanted to flag it. Flagged, Brielle said. She moved the agenda to the next item. She sat in her office after the meeting with the door closed and her phone face down on the desk, and she allowed herself 5 minutes. This was a system she'd built. 5 minutes to feel whatever the meeting had left behind, and then she put it somewhere organized and moved forward. 5 minutes, no more. She felt the meeting. The specific quality of being discussed as a problem in your own room. The calculation that had happened between December and January. Someone calling someone. Someone suggesting to someone. The infrastructure of professional social pressure doing its quiet work. Warren Holt hadn't been in the room. He'd never need to be in the room for any of this to happen. That was how people like Warren Holt operated. The damage didn't require his presence. 5 minutes. Then she picked up her phone and called her legal team. Nolan noticed something was wrong before she said anything, which was a capability she was still adjusting to. Being read that accurately without having performed the signal. She'd come to his apartment on a Thursday evening with the intention of being fine. Because she was fine, the board meeting had been handled, and she was moving forward. She was good at moving forward. He opened the door and looked at her and said, "What happened?" "Nothing catastrophic," she said, which was true and also completely insufficient as a description of her day. "Come in," he said. Not "you're okay" and not "tell me everything." Just the simple, practical invitation, which was the right thing. They ended up in the kitchen, which had become their default location for things that needed talking through. Sadie was at a friend's overnight. First sleepover she'd been to since October, which Nolan had mentioned with the particular tone of a parent relieved to see his kid doing something normal and kid-shaped. The apartment was quiet. Brielle told him about the board meeting. She kept it factual, which was her natural register for professional things, but she watched his face as she talked, and she didn't try to smooth the sharp edges out of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He had his coffee cup in both hands, and he was looking at the table. "Warren Holt did this," he said. Not a question. "I can't prove it, but yes." And the board, some of them went along with it. 2 of them, Daniel Foss and Richard Park. Patricia Ewan didn't, and Marcus was furious, which he communicated later and privately. She paused. "The meeting moved on. I handled it." "I know you handled it." He looked up. "That's not what I'm thinking about." "What are you thinking about?" He set the cup down. "I'm thinking that me being in your life is giving people ammunition they wouldn't otherwise have." He said it plainly, not as a conclusion, but as a fact he was examining. "Not because you're weak, because they're targeting what they can reach, and right now what they can reach is this." "Nolan, I'm not going anywhere," he said. He said it first before she could respond, and with such complete absence of drama that it landed heavier than a speech would have. "I just want to be honest about what's happening. I don't want you to manage it away from me and then carry it by yourself." She looked at him. "I handle things by myself. I'm built that way." "I know." He held her gaze. "How's that going?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "It's going fine," she said. And then more honestly, "It's exhausting." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know something about that." She thought about the custody case and 3 different jobs and raising Sadie alone and carrying the legal battle for 8 months before she'd even known about it. She thought about what it cost to carry things that should have been shared. "We're both bad at letting people help," she said. "Extremely," he agreed. "That seems like a problem." "It seems like something we could work on." He looked at her steadily. "If you want to." She sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, the January dark was total, and the snow from earlier in the week was still piled at the edges of the sidewalk below, grayish-white under the streetlights. Elena's painting, the one in the living room doorway, the portrait with the direct gaze, was visible from here, partially lit by the lamp in the corner. "I went to therapy," she said. "After the gala, I moved the appointment up." "Yeah?" "I told Carol I was afraid of hurting you, or Sadie." She paused. "By being attached to all the noise around me." "What did she say?" "She asked me if I believed you when you told me it wasn't my fault." Brielle looked at him. "And I told her I believed you meant it, which isn't the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "And now?" "And now I think—" She stopped, started again. "I think the board meeting was Warren Holt doing what people like Warren Holt do. And I think I handled it correctly. And I think the fact that it's connected to you is not the same as it being caused by you." She exhaled slowly. "That's the distinction I've been trying to get to." "You get there on your own?" "Carol helped." She paused. "And Terrell. And—" She looked at him. "And the fact that you said, 'I'm not going anywhere' every time I gave you a reason to reconsider." He half smiled. "I'm consistent." "You're stubborn," she said. "It's different." Gets it from Sadie, he said. She laughed at that. A real one. Unguarded. And the tension in her chest, which had been sitting there since the board meeting, shifted slightly. Not gone. Just occupying less space. The second board incident was 3 weeks later and came from a different direction. A financial journalist named Tyler Reese, who wrote a column for a well-read business publication, published a piece on January 31st about the romanticization of the grounded billionaire narrative in tech media. The piece was nominally about industry trends. It was specifically about Brielle. It used phrases like calculated relatability and strategic image rehabilitation and quoted an unnamed source described as a Chicago area investment professional who suggested that Brielle's current public relationship was functioning as a distraction from slower than projected Q3 user acquisition numbers. The Q3 numbers were slower. That was true. They were slower because she'd made a deliberate architectural decision to rebuild the platform's back end before scaling. A decision she'd documented and explained to the board in September. A decision that every member of her technical leadership team had supported and that was already showing results in Q4. The slower numbers were a feature of a correct strategic choice, not evidence of distraction. The unnamed source clearly knew this, had access to board-level information, had chosen to frame it differently. She knew who it was before Marcus Tang called her. "Warren Holt," Marcus said. "Yes. Can we prove it?" "Not from the article." She was already pulling files. "But there are other ways." "Brielle." Marcus. Who had access to the Q3 framing in that exact form? The specific phrase slower than projected user acquisition? That phrasing is from Daniel Foss's October notes. It's not how we ever framed it publicly. It came from inside the room. A silence. "You think Foss leaked it?" "I think Warren Holt asked Daniel Foss for something useful, and Daniel Foss, who has had a relationship with Warren Holt for 15 years and who has been on the wrong side of 2 board votes this fiscal year, gave it to him." She paused. "That's a material breach. Get our legal team on it." "Are we sure we want to go there?" "I am." She went to Nolan's apartment that night later than she'd planned, later than she usually showed up, past 10 on a weeknight in January. He was still awake, because he always seemed to be still awake when she arrived late. She suspected he didn't fully sleep until he knew she was somewhere settled, which was something she'd noticed and hadn't said anything about yet. He opened the door, read her. "It's getting worse," he said. "It's getting active," she said, "which is different. Worse implies it's winning. It's not winning, but it's moving." She stepped inside. "I'm going to need to go after Warren Holt directly, not in the press, through legal and regulatory channels, but directly." He was quiet for a moment, processing this. "What does that look like?" "It looks like I've been building a file for 3 months." She sat down. She set her bag on the floor and looked at him. "The Q3 information that was leaked, that's a fiduciary breach. That's prosecutable. And there's more. Warren Holt has been maneuvering against a healthcare technology competitor of mine for 4 years. I've been watching it. If what I think is there is actually there, it's not just professional misconduct, it's fraud." Nolan sat across from her. His expression was the one he had when he was thinking about structural load. Where was the weight? Where were the failure points? What held? "How long have you known?" he asked. "I've suspected for 2 years." She paused. "I've had confirmation for 6 weeks." "Since the gala?" "Since the week after." She looked at her hands. "I wasn't going to do anything with it. As long as he stayed in his lane, I was going to leave it alone. But he came into my company, and he came into my boardroom, and he's been aiming this at me, and at you, and at Sadie's custody case, and I'm done leaving it alone." Nolan looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay? What do you need?" She stared at him. "That's not... Don't you want to think about what this means? If I move against Holt, it's going to be loud. It's going to be very public. It's going to hit every business outlet in the country, and there will be a period where it looks like I'm the aggressor, and he's the victim, and the coverage of us is going to be..." "Brielle," his voice was even. "I asked what you need." She looked at him. Something in her chest, Something wound tight for weeks, pulled tighter for one moment, and then released. Just slightly, like something that had been holding too much being given permission to redistribute the weight. Time, she said. My legal team needs time to build it correctly, and I need the custody motion resolved before we go public with anything, because I don't want it to become a variable in the court's assessment of Sadie's home environment. He nodded slowly. My lawyer thinks February, the court date. February 20th, she said. She'd looked it up. You looked it up? Of course I looked it up. He was quiet for a moment, something moving through his expression that she couldn't quite read. And then he said, You know you don't have to. I'm aware I don't have to. She held his gaze. I want to. That's different. The quiet in the apartment was the particular quiet of late January, the cold pressing against the windows, the building settling, Sadie asleep down the hall, Elena's paintings on the walls, the portrait with the direct gaze visible from where Brielle sat. She looked at it for a moment. The woman in the portrait looked back with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where she was. Can I ask you something? Brielle said. Yeah. The night at the restaurant, when you said that word, she paused. Were you scared of what it might? She gestured at the entirety of the situation. Of all of this? He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which was his way, and she'd learned to wait for the real answer rather than the first one. No, he said finally. Not of this. He paused. Scared of other things, scared of making the wrong call for Sadie, scared of offering something I couldn't back up. He met her eyes. But not scared of you. She absorbed that. You should be, a little, she said. I'm difficult. You're careful, he said. Those aren't the same thing. I'm also difficult. Yeah, he said, without any particular heat. So am I. She smiled at that, and he smiled back, said, the crooked, unperformed one that had nothing behind it except what it was. And the room held them both in the January cold, in the particular quiet of a late weeknight, in the kind of ordinary, imperfect, necessary moment that nobody writes about because it doesn't look like anything from the outside. From the inside, it was everything. 3 days later, Brielle was in a rideshare heading to a partner meeting downtown when her phone buzzed with a text from Nolan. No words, just a photo. Sadie at her desk, the bridge model in the background, holding up a finished drawing. A horse. 4 legs this time. She zoomed in. In the corner, in Sadie's careful second-grade printing, it said, For Brielle. I gave her regular legs because she is already fast enough. Brielle sat in the rideshare in the gray January morning and looked at this drawing, and she felt something that was not complicated at all. She saved it to her camera roll. She set it as her phone wallpaper. She was aware, sitting there, that she was smiling at her phone like a person who had never learned to be strategic about her expressions, and she did not correct for it. She arrived at the partner meeting 4 minutes later and was, as she always was, completely excellent. But her phone was in her pocket, and on it was a 4-legged horse, and that was the thing she kept coming back to underneath everything else. All through the meeting, all through the afternoon, all through the drive home. The drawing. The 8-year-old who'd decided she was already fast enough. The man who had not once, in 4 months, looked at her like she was the problem. She was still learning what to do with being seen like that, learning how to stay inside it without flinching. Learning, slowly, imperfectly, with the specific stubbornness of someone who'd spent 30 years becoming an expert at not needing this, how to let it be real. She was getting there. The community center was on the northwest side, a converted warehouse with painted cinderblock walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly in the high ceilings, and a gym floor that had been refinished so many times, the wood had lost any particular color and become something more honest. Just use, just years, just the accumulated mark of everything that had happened on it. Nolan had been volunteering there on Saturday mornings for 2 years. He'd never mentioned it to Brielle directly, not in the way of something he was proud of, more in the way of something that was simply part of his week, the same way the HVAC jobs were, and the Tuesday nights helping Sadie with math were. He brought her on a Saturday in early February, 9 days before the custody hearing. He hadn't framed it as anything particular. He'd texted on Thursday, "Saturday morning, if you're free. I want to show you something." She'd said yes without asking what, which was new for her. She'd spent her whole adult life needing the agenda in advance, the itinerary, the projected outcome. But she was learning, slowly, that Nolan didn't set things up for effect. If he wanted to show her something, it was because it mattered, and because he thought she should see it. They arrived at 8:30. The kids started filtering in at 9, 12 of them, ages 6 through 11, from the neighborhood Saturday program, arts and basic engineering concepts taught by whoever showed up to teach them. Nolan had been teaching the engineering segment since a friend of his had started the program and needed someone who actually knew what a load-bearing wall was. Brielle sat near the back and watched. He was different with them than she'd seen him anywhere else. Not dramatically different. He was still the same flat-voiced, unhurried man who fixed cabinet hinges and said exactly what he meant. But there was something that came through with the kids that she'd only seen in pieces before. A lightness. The particular ease of someone operating exactly where they were supposed to be. He got down on the floor with them without self-consciousness. He let a 6-year-old explain her tower structure to him with complete attention. And when the tower fell, he said, "Okay, what went wrong? What do we do differently?" rather than "let me show you," and watched her figure it out. A boy named Marcus, 7, missing his 2 front teeth, serious in the way certain 7-year-olds were about everything, appointed himself Brielle's guide within 4 minutes of her arrival. He showed her the papier-mâché bridge they'd built over 3 weeks. He explained the load distribution problem they'd encountered and solved with the authority of someone presenting a completed paper. "Nolan says the triangle is the strongest shape," Marcus said. "He's right," Brielle said. "I know." Marcus looked at her. "Are you his girlfriend?" "I'm his friend," she said. Marcus assessed this. "He talks about you," he said, and moved on to show her the bridge's support columns with the swift disinterest of a child who'd filed that information and found it adequate. She looked across the room at Nolan, who was helping 2 girls re-engineer a collapsed archway, and she thought, "He talks about me." She didn't know why that landed the way it did. She'd known for months that she mattered to him, but there was something about hearing it from a 7-year-old with missing teeth that made it more real in a way she couldn't explain precisely. The kids didn't care about ClearPath. They didn't care about the tabloids or Warren Holt or Q3 user acquisition numbers or what anyone thought about who was standing next to whom at a charity gala. They cared about the bridge and the triangle and whether the tower would stand this time. And they ran to Nolan the way kids ran toward things they trusted completely, without strategy, without calculation, just the clean, direct vector of genuine affection. And in the middle of all of it, somewhere around 10:30, a small girl named Destiny, 6 years old, round-faced, wearing a sweater with a cat on it, walked directly up to Brielle, climbed into the chair beside her without asking, and put her head on Brielle's arm. Brielle went very still. Destiny looked up at her and said, "You're soft." Yes," Brielle said. "I'm tired," Destiny said, and closed her eyes. Brielle sat there with the 6-year-old asleep against her arm and looked across the room at Nolan, who had seen the whole thing and was watching her with an expression that she'd never seen on him before, open in a way he usually wasn't, unguarded, like something he'd been holding had been allowed for this one moment to show on his face without editing. She didn't look away. Neither did he. Look. Afterward, when the kids had gone and the room had been cleared and Nolan had helped stack folding chairs against the wall with the ease of someone who did it every week, they walked out into the gray February morning together. Cold, but the specific cold of a day that was trying to be something else eventually. Thin light behind the clouds, the smell of the air with that early suggestion of change that Chicago sometimes produced in February as a feint before going back to being brutal. They walked a block without saying anything. She'd noticed that Nolan was often quiet after the Saturday mornings, in a way that wasn't withdrawn but was settled, the way a person was quiet after something that had given rather than taken. "How long?" she asked. 2 years, he said. "After Elena died, I needed, I don't know, something that required me to show up somewhere that wasn't work or Sadie, somewhere I had to be useful in a way that didn't feel like survival." He paused. Sadie was my whole world, but she was also a grief I was carrying. The kids here didn't know me as a widower. They just knew me as the guy who knew about bridges. Brielle nodded slowly. The little girl, she said. Destiny. Yeah. He looked straight ahead. She does that. Finds whoever's new and decides they're trustworthy. She's been right every time. She called me soft. She's tactile. She means it as a compliment. I know. Brielle paused. I didn't want to move. I was afraid of waking her up. He looked over at her briefly. You've been very careful, about Sadie, about not pushing. She's not mine to push with. No, but you've been good with her in a way that doesn't perform. He paused. She notices. She told me you were, and I'm quoting directly, not annoying like some adults. Brielle laughed. That might be the best review I've gotten. Top 5 for me, too. He paused. They were at the corner. He stopped walking, and she stopped with him. I want to tell you something. She looked at him. The night at the restaurant, he said. When I said stay. She waited. He looked out at the street for a moment, not stalling, just finding the right approach. I told you I said it because nobody should eat alone after being treated that way. That was true. He paused. But it wasn't the whole truth. Okay, she said. Elena, when she was... He stopped, cleared his throat once. In the last weeks, she knew. She was clear-eyed about it in a way I couldn't always be. She was better at the hard facts than I was. He exhaled. She made me promise things. Some of it was practical. The apartment, Sadie's school, the paintings. Some of it was the other kind. Brielle was very still. She told me, he said, that when I saw someone who had been told they were unworthy by a person or by a room or by the whole accumulated weight of a life of being told so, I should be the one who stayed. His voice was even, but she could hear what was underneath the evenness, the thing it was containing. She said that I had a way of just staying, that it was the thing she loved about me when she was sick, that I didn't run from hard things, that I stayed in them. He looked at Brielle. And she made me promise to use it, after she was gone, to use it for someone who needed it. The street was quiet. The cold pressed in around them. A car passed, and its tires made that wet sound on the asphalt that snow-edged Chicago streets made in February. The word wasn't random, Nolan said. I know I said it seemed like the right word, and it did, but it was also a promise I made to her, and the first time I saw a situation where I understood why she'd asked for it, the word just came out. He met her eyes. It wasn't calculated. I want you to know that. I wasn't thinking this is the moment, this is what Elena meant. It was more like the promise had become part of me, and it found the moment on its own. Brielle stood on the sidewalk in the February cold and looked at this man. This complicated, stubborn, imperfect, honest man. And she felt something she'd been circling for months resolve, not with drama, but with the quiet finality of something clicking into place. She gave you to me, Brielle said. The words came out before she'd decided on them. Elena, in a way. I've thought about that, Nolan said. I don't want to oversimplify what happened. I'm not saying she planned it. I'm saying she knew you well enough to know that you'd be the kind of man who carried a promise like that, and she was right. Brielle looked at him. She knew exactly who she was married to. He was quiet for a long moment. The thin light behind the clouds shifted slightly, a brief warmer quality to it, there and gone. She would have liked you, he said. She liked people who were honest about the hard things. She had very little patience for people who pretended everything was fine. He paused. She would have liked that you went to therapy after the gala instead of just powering through. I powered through the therapy too a little. Yeah, but you went. He half smiled. That's the part that counts. But she thought about Elena's promise all the way through the week before the custody hearing. She thought about it while she was preparing the material for the Warren Holt case, building the file, layering the evidence, consulting with her legal team and a securities attorney who had a particular expertise in the kind of maneuvering that Warren Holt had been doing for years behind the respectable screen of his investment portfolio. The file was substantial. It had taken shape over months, and now it was dense with documentation, board communications, financial records, the paper trail of a man who'd been systematically undermining competitors and insulating himself from consequence with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. She kept the two things separate in her mind. The custody hearing first, Warren Holt after. February 20th was a Thursday. Nolan's lawyer, a woman named Diane Cho, who was compact and precise and had the particular quality of someone who had been underestimated enough times to have turned it into a professional advantage, had said they were in a strong position. The Vasquez family's media disruption argument had been weakened by a lack of demonstrable impact. There was no evidence that Sadie had been distressed, no school reports, no therapist notes, no corroboration from any of the adults in Sadie's life outside the Vasquez family itself. The argument was perception. Diane Cho's counterargument was evidence. Brielle went with Nolan to the courthouse. She hadn't asked to come. She'd said 2 weeks earlier, "Tell me what you need for the 20th." And he'd said, after a pause that was him deciding something, "I'd like you to be there, if you're willing." She'd said yes immediately, which was no longer a decision she had to make and had not been for some time. The courthouse was Cook County, downtown, a building that smelled like all courthouses, paper and institutional heating, and the particular tension of people who were there because something important was being decided. They arrived early. Diane Cho was already there. She briefed them in the hallway in the flat, rapid way of someone for whom this hallway and this briefing were familiar terrain. The Vasquez family was already in the waiting area when Nolan and Brielle came around the corner. Brielle had not met them before. She'd formed impressions from what Nolan had told her. That they weren't bad people, that they loved Sadie genuinely, that their belief in their own position was sincere rather than cynical. They were in their late 60s, the Vasquez grandparents, Rosa and Miguel. Rosa had Elena's eyes, or what Brielle recognized from the portrait as Elena's eyes, dark and direct. She was looking at Nolan with an expression that was complicated, not hostile, but not easy. Miguel was sitting beside her with the contained stillness of someone in a place they didn't want to be. Nolan nodded at them. Miguel nodded back. Rosa looked at Brielle, and for a moment something crossed her face that Brielle couldn't fully read. Assessment, maybe, or something more complicated than that. Nolan and Brielle sat across from them and didn't speak. Diane Cho sat beside Nolan and reviewed notes. Brielle sat on his other side with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her face composed, which was the face she wore in boardrooms and courthouses and places where displaying what she felt would cost something she wasn't willing to spend. She was acutely aware that her presence was itself a statement, that she was here, beside him, visible, in this space where what it looked like mattered. She'd thought about whether to come. She'd asked Diane Cho directly, through Nolan, whether her presence would help or hurt. Diane had said, "If she's in his life, her absence from this proceeding suggests she's a liability he's managing. Her presence suggests she's a stable fixture. Presence is better than absence." Stable fixture. She turned that phrase over and decided it was accurate enough. Passé. The hearing itself was 2 hours. She waited outside, only parties and their counsel in the room. She sat on a bench in the courthouse hallway and answered emails she didn't need to answer and watched people pass and thought about bridges and the triangle being the strongest shape and destiny asleep against her arm and the words spoken in a restaurant 4 months ago that had rearranged her entire year. When the door opened and Nolan came out first and looked at her, she read it on his face before he said anything. He sat down beside her on the bench. "Primary custody stays with me," he said. "The Vasquez family gets 2 weeks in summer and alternating Thanksgivings." He paused. "Diane says it's a good outcome. She says the media argument failed completely. The judge found no demonstrated impact on Sadie's well-being." Brielle exhaled. "Okay," she said. "Yeah." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at the middle distance. The posture of someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just been told they could set it down. She watched him process it, the way he processed things. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the slow physical settling of a man whose body was catching up to something his mind had been managing. She put her hand on his back, between his shoulder blades, just resting there. He didn't look at her, but she felt him breathe. After a moment he said, I need to call Sadie. I know. She's at Mrs. Okafor's. I know. He sat up and took out his phone and called his daughter. And Brielle sat beside him on the courthouse bench and listened to one side of the conversation. Yeah, Bug, it's good news. You're staying home. You're staying home. And she watched Nolan Hart hold the phone and close his eyes briefly. And she thought about a woman named Elena who had known her husband well enough to ask him to carry a word like a promise, and about a promise carried 4 years until the right moment found it. She filed the motion against Warren Holt on March 3rd. Not a press release, not a statement, an actual filing, securities fraud, in partnership with the SEC, which had been quietly developing its own parallel investigation that Brielle's legal team had not known about until they'd made contact in January and discovered they were looking at the same man from different angles. The SEC case folded into hers neatly, like two incomplete pictures assembling into something whole. The filing was specific and documented and covered 4 years of Holt Capital's systematic interference with healthcare technology competitors through manufactured board disruptions, strategic misinformation, and the misuse of fiduciary relationships with institutional investors to redirect capital away from companies Holt had targeted. ClearPath was one of 4 named companies. The others had been smaller and less able to fight back. 3 of them had been acquired at suppressed valuations by a Holt-adjacent holding group. Brielle's company had not been acquired. Brielle had fought back. The story broke on a Friday afternoon, which was not an accident. Financial stories broke on Fridays because the weekend news cycle was a strategic choice, giving the initial frenzy time to metabolize before markets opened Monday. Constance had organized the information release with the precision of someone conducting a very careful orchestra. By Friday evening, it was the lead story on every major financial news outlet. By Saturday morning, Warren Holt's attorney had issued a statement calling the allegations without merit. By Saturday afternoon, 2 of the 3 smaller companies that had been named in the filing had issued their own statements corroborating the pattern. Brielle was in her office Saturday morning. She'd gone in early, alone, because she needed to be somewhere that was hers for the initial hours of this, and her phone didn't stop. She managed it with Constance and her legal team and Marcus Tang and the systematic efficiency she'd built over 8 years of making things happen. She answered what needed to be answered. She let the rest go to voicemail. At noon, Daniel Foss sent her an email. It was 3 sentences. It said he owed her an apology. It said he had not understood the full scope of his relationship with Warren Holt until the filing made it visible. It said he intended to resign from the board. She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Marcus and her legal team and wrote back a 2-sentence acknowledgement that said nothing and committed to nothing, because she was not in the business of accepting insufficient apologies on a timeline convenient for the person apologizing. At 2 in the afternoon, she left the office. She drove north. Nolan opened the door before she knocked, which meant he'd been watching for her, which was something she'd stopped pretending she didn't notice. I saw the news, he said. I know. You okay? She stood in the doorway for a moment. She thought about how to answer that honestly. I think so, she said. I think I will be. I feel strange, like something that's been pressing on me has lifted and now I don't quite know how to stand without compensating for it. He stepped back to let her in. Sadie was at the kitchen table building something elaborate from cardboard and tape, which she often did on Saturdays now as a companion activity to whatever adult conversation was happening around her. She looked up when Brielle came in. Dad said you did something brave, Sadie said. Brielle looked at Nolan. She asked why you were on the news, he said. I gave her the simplified version. Oh, the man was being mean, Sadie said, with the clean moral summary of an 8-year-old. And you told on him. That's essentially accurate, Brielle said. Good, said Sadie. My teacher says that's always the right thing to do. She went back to her cardboard. Brielle stood in the kitchen and felt the strange, unfamiliar feeling of having done the hard thing and not having to explain why to the people in this room. They already knew why. They'd been in it with her differently the whole time. Sit down, Nolan said. You look like you've been standing in a windstorm. I've been in my office for 6 hours. That's the same thing. He moved toward the kettle. Tea or coffee? Coffee. She sat. She set her keys and her phone on the table and looked at Sadie's cardboard construction, which appeared to be a building of some kind, multi-storied, with an exterior that suggested she'd been paying more attention to the bridge discussions than anyone had necessarily realized. "What are you building?" Brielle asked. "A hospital," Sadie said, not looking up, "with a roof garden. I read that roof gardens are good for sick people." Brielle was very still. "Where did you read that?" she asked. "In a magazine at Dr. Patel's office." Sadie added a new floor with the tape dispenser. "I thought it was good, so I remembered it." Brielle looked at the hospital. She looked at the little girl building it. She thought about a platform she'd built in an apartment with $12,000 and a whiteboard, and about accessible healthcare navigation, and about the rural access gap and the demographic she'd told Nolan she'd built it for, and about what it looked like when a child decided something was worth remembering and kept it. "Can I help?" she asked. Sadie assessed her. "You can do the roof garden," she said. I'll show you how I want it." Nolan set coffee down beside Brielle and went back to what he'd been doing before she arrived, which was reading, settled into the armchair in the living room with the ease of someone in their right place. Elena's portrait visible from the kitchen. The apartment warm and slightly chaotic, and full of things that had been used and kept and lived with. Brielle pulled a piece of cardboard toward herself. Sadie handed her scissors. "The garden needs to have different sections," Sadie said. "Flowers and also vegetables. Both are important." "Agreed," said Brielle. "And it needs to be accessible," Sadie said, with the confidence of someone deploying a recently acquired vocabulary word. "For wheelchairs and things." Brielle looked at her. "Where did you learn that word?" "Dad. He says if you build something for people, you have to build it for all of them." She was already cutting. "That's just engineering." Brielle looked at Nolan, who had heard this from his armchair and was not quite smiling but was close to it. "Your dad is right," she said. "I know," said Sadie. They worked on the hospital for an hour. Sadie directing, Brielle executing. Nolan occasionally called in for structural consultation on whether the lobby column placement was load-bearing compliant, which he assessed with mock seriousness and then helped fix when it turned out it wasn't. At some point, the afternoon shifted from bright gray to darker gray, and someone turned a lamp on and the kitchen got warm, and Brielle realized she hadn't looked at her phone in 45 minutes. She thought about the board meeting in January. She thought about the courthouse hallway and the bench and her hand between his shoulder blades. She thought about 6 months of carrying two things at once, the building and the dismantling. The figuring out how to be in this and how to survive what was being aimed at it simultaneously. And she thought about what Carol had asked her that first session after the gala. "What are you most afraid of right now?" She'd said hurting them, Brielle and Sadie, by being what she was. She looked at Sadie, who was attaching a paper elevator to the side of the cardboard hospital with the focused seriousness of a person whose architectural vision was non-negotiable. She looked at Nolan in the armchair, reading, one leg over the arm of the chair, in the comfortable bad posture of someone completely at ease. She looked at Elena's paintings on the walls, holding the room, holding the memory, holding the proof of something that had been real and had not been erased by what came after. She thought, "I'm not afraid of hurting them anymore. I'm afraid of not being here." That was different. That was better. That was the thing that meant something. She stayed for dinner. She hadn't planned to. Nolan made pasta with the focused, methodical approach he brought to cooking, which was not the cooking of someone who enjoyed cooking, but of someone who had learned it because it needed doing and done it long enough to be reliable. Sadie set the table with the ceramic dishes that had a chip on two of them that nobody had ever replaced. They ate together in the kitchen, the three of them, with the easy, low-level noise of a weeknight meal. Sadie talking about the hospital's roof garden with the specificity of a project manager. Nolan redirecting her twice when she tried to redistribute her broccoli under the table toward a location she believed was out of adult sightline. Brielle watching all of it with the particular feeling of someone who had spent a long time knowing what she wanted and not quite believing it was the kind of thing she could have. After dinner, Sadie brushed her teeth with the aggressive pace of a child trying to get the obligation done, said goodnight to Brielle with the brief, unself-conscious warmth of someone for whom Brielle had long since ceased to be a guest, and disappeared down the hall. Nolan came back to the kitchen, sat across from her. "The hospital was good," he said. "Sadie designed it. I just followed instructions." She doesn't let just anyone follow her instructions. Brielle looked at her coffee cup. She stopped. I don't have words for what she is. She's remarkable. She's a kid, he said. She's just herself. That's what I mean. Brielle looked up. Being just yourself is the hardest thing. Kids do it, and then most people spend the rest of their lives trying to get back to it. He held her gaze. You're getting back to it, he said. Slowly. She paused. You're helping. Good, he said. The apartment was quiet around them. The lamp in the corner was on, and the kitchen light was on, and outside the February dark had settled completely, the city doing its late-night low hum. The hospital stood on the kitchen table between them, paper roof garden and all, slightly crooked, extremely specific, built by two people following an 8-year-old's vision of what care should look like. Nolan, she said. Yeah. She looked at him. She thought about a word said in a restaurant, a promise carried 4 years, a little girl who had kept something worth keeping, a man who had stayed in every hard thing without being asked twice. I love you, she said. She said it simply, the way things were true. He looked at her for a moment, not startled. She had the sense that he'd known, the way he knew most things about her before she said them, his particular attention having long since mapped the landscape of her in detail. But hearing it still did something to his face, something that was not his usual composure, something underneath it that was just him, unmanaged. I know, he said, and then quietly, I love you too. He said it the same way she had, without performance, without building up to it, just the fact of it, placed between them like something they'd both been carrying to the same location. She nodded. He nodded. Outside, the city went on doing what cities did, moving, building, breaking down and rebuilding, full of people in lit windows carrying their own imperfect, ordinary, extraordinary things. Inside, in the kitchen with the chipped dishes and the cardboard hospital and the lamp making everything amber warm, it was quiet and simple and real. And Brielle Mercer, who had spent 30 years being exceptional at everything except believing she deserved this, sat across from the man who had stayed and let it be true. March was loud in the way that consequences always were. The Warren Holt story didn't cycle out the way tabloid noise cycled out. It compounded. Each day brought something new. A former associate who confirmed the pattern on record, a regulatory filing that surfaced additional documentation, a statement from one of the smaller companies that had been acquired at suppressed valuations detailing, for the first time publicly, the specific mechanics of how it had happened. The SEC moved quickly, which surprised some people and didn't surprise Brielle at all. She'd shared her file with them in January, and they'd been building toward this longer than she had. They were ready. Holt Capital's stock price dropped 42% in the first week. 2 institutional investors withdrew their partnerships by the end of the second. Warren Holt's attorney released 3 statements in 10 days, each one more carefully worded than the last, each one walking back something the previous statement had implied. The 4th statement, which came on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of March, announced that Warren Holt was stepping down from the management of Holt Capital pending the resolution of regulatory inquiries. Brielle read it at her kitchen island at 6:30 in the morning with her coffee cooling beside her. She read it twice. She felt something she'd expected to feel more dramatically, a cleanness, like the end of pressure, quiet rather than triumphant. She'd spent months building this, and it had landed with the precision she'd aimed for, and now she was sitting in her kitchen in the early morning light, and the thing she kept thinking about was not Warren Holt at all. She kept thinking about the restaurant, October, the rain on the windows, the word. She called Constance first because that was the correct professional sequence. Constance was already awake, already monitoring, already had a prepared response strategy for the day's coverage. They spoke for 20 minutes with the efficient shorthand of 6 years of working together. When they hung up, Constance said, "You did this right, Brielle. All of it." She sat with that for a moment after the call ended. She didn't need Constance to tell her she'd done it right. She'd known it was right from the moment she'd filed, and she'd known it was right before that, when she'd been building the file quietly while everything else was happening. The gala, the board meeting, the custody hearing, the kitchen table, the cardboard hospital. She'd carried the 2 things simultaneously, and neither had collapsed the other, which was itself a kind of evidence about who she was becoming. She texted Nolan. "It's done. He's stepping down." He wrote back in 4 minutes. "I know. I've been watching the news. How are you?" She typed, "I feel like I set something heavy down, and I'm not sure yet what I look like without it." He wrote, "You look the same. Good." She smiled at her phone. "Sadie awake?" she wrote. "She's making toast. She burned the first piece. She's very upset about it." "Tell her I'm on my way," Brielle wrote. She put on her coat before she'd finished deciding to do it. Daniel Foss resigned from the board officially on March 17th. Richard Park, who had been the other vote in the January meeting, did not resign but had become so conspicuously absent from board communications that his effective presence had already evaporated. Patricia Ewan, who had watched the whole thing with the sharp attention of someone who'd been on boards long enough to know exactly what she was watching, sent Brielle a handwritten note that said 3 sentences. "You handled it correctly. You protected the company and the people in it. I'm glad you stayed." Brielle kept the note in her desk drawer. The board restructuring took April and into May. She recruited 2 new independent directors, a woman who ran a health equity nonprofit out of Atlanta, and a retired federal regulator who knew the healthcare technology landscape from the oversight side. Both were right. Both were, in the particular way that mattered to Brielle, people she would not have to manage. They said what they thought. They expected the same. ClearPath's Q1 numbers came in stronger than projected. The back-end rebuild she'd made the Q3 architectural decision for was producing exactly the results she'd told the board it would in September, which she did not say out loud in the meeting because saying "I told you" was a pleasure she could not afford professionally, but privately allowed herself for approximately 4 minutes on the drive home. The tiered access model launched in May, the one Nolan had asked about the night they met. "You built it for us and then priced us out of it." The model that had been in development for 18 months and that her policy team had fought for with the particular tenacity of people who understood exactly who needed it. She sent him a link the morning it launched. He sent back a screenshot of the announcement. No comment, just a single punctuation mark. A period. Like something completed. She understood exactly what he meant. Oppan? The custody arrangement settled into its new shape over the spring. The Vasquez family came for Memorial Day weekend, which was the first time they'd seen Sadie under the new court order rather than the old contested version of reality. Nolan had prepared Sadie for it in the way he prepared her for most hard things. Directly, without softening it into dishonesty, trusting her to handle the actual truth rather than a comfortable version of it. Sadie handled it the way she handled most things, with the focused, slightly rigid determination of a child who had decided how she felt about something and was going to hold that position. She was polite to her grandparents. She showed Rosa the bridge model with the careful pride of someone who wanted them to see something that mattered, even if the larger conversation around the visit was still finding its right shape. Miguel spent an afternoon with Nolan on the back porch of the building. Brielle watched from the kitchen window, not intending to eavesdrop, noticing the particular quality of the conversation without being able to hear it, the way 2 men sat when they were saying something honest to each other, angled slightly apart, looking at the same middle distance. She didn't ask Nolan what they'd talked about. He told her later that evening, while Sadie was in the bath. Miguel had said he was sorry. Not for wanting Sadie. That was love, and he didn't apologize for love. But for the method, for the lawyer and the motion and the media argument. He'd said Elena wouldn't have wanted it done that way, and he knew it, and he was sorry. Nolan had said he understood. Brielle listened to this and thought about the complexity of grief, how it made people reach, how it made them grip too hard, how it made them use arguments that weren't quite right because the real argument was just that they missed her. They missed Elena. They missed the thing that was gone, and Sadie was the closest they could get to it. "Are you okay with them?" she asked. "The Vasquezes?" "I'm working on it," he said. "Rosa loves her. Miguel loves her. They just—" He paused. "They're figuring out how to love her from a distance. That's its own thing to learn." "It is," Brielle said. "Are you going to help them learn it?" He thought about that. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think Elena would have wanted that." Brielle nodded slowly. "She sounds like she was someone worth becoming," she said, which was the best way she knew to say what she meant, which was that she had enormous respect for a woman she'd never met, who had made a man into someone who said stay and meant it all the way down. June came warm and early, the way Chicago sometimes surprised you. The lake going from steel gray to something genuinely blue, the city unclenching from 6 months of cold and doing the particular thing it did in summer, which was remembering that it was actually a beautiful place. Sadie finished second grade on a Wednesday with the triumphant energy of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment since approximately October. Her teacher sent a note home that said she had excellent spatial reasoning and an unusual commitment to structural accuracy in her drawings, which Nolan read aloud at the kitchen table while Sadie ate celebratory ice cream and explained that she'd been testing bridge load concepts in art class all year and that her teacher had only recently realized this was intentional. She thought I just liked drawing rectangles, Sadie said, with the satisfaction of a long game concluded successfully. You were running an experiment, Brielle said. I was collecting data, Sadie agreed. Nolan looked at Brielle over Sadie's head with an expression that said something they'd been saying to each other for months, in all the small wordless ways that people who paid attention to each other developed. This one meant, she's going to be something. Brielle looked back with the answer, which was, she already is. It was in June that Nolan went back to engineering, not immediately and not without difficulty. He'd been out of the field proper for 3 years, and the job market for structural engineers in Chicago was specific, and he had 3 other jobs he was untangling himself from, and the whole process took 6 weeks from the first conversation to the first day. He'd mentioned it to her one evening in May, the way he mentioned things that mattered, mid-sentence, in passing, like he was checking whether the words fit in the air before he committed to them. I've been thinking about going back, he said. Engineering. There's a firm in the West Loop that does municipal infrastructure, bridges, transit systems. They reached out. She looked at him. When? 2 months ago. Nolan. He stopped. I was waiting to see if the custody thing resolved. I didn't want to take on something new when I didn't know what the shape of things was going to be. And now? Now I know the shape of things. He met her eyes. So I'm going back. She thought about the bridge, the triangle being the strongest shape. The man who'd spent 3 years installing HVAC systems and doing contracting work and raising his daughter with the careful, exhausted love of someone who had reorganized everything around what mattered most and deferred everything else until later. Later had arrived. Call them back, she said. He did. He started on the second Monday of June. He came home that evening and sat in the kitchen with his work bag still on his shoulder and looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at Sadie, who was drawing at the table with the focused intensity of someone mid-project. How was it? Sadie asked, without looking up. Good, he said. He sounded surprised by this slightly, like he'd prepared for difficult and found something else instead. Really good, actually. Sadie looked up, assessed him. You look like you look after the community center, she said. He considered this. Yeah, he said. Kind of. That's the look when you've been doing the right thing, Sadie said, and went back to drawing. Brielle was standing at the counter and she looked at this child, this 8-year-old who had been watching her father closely enough for long enough that she had named the exact quality of his face when he was where he was supposed to be. And she felt something that was too large to fit neatly inside the moment, but that she held anyway, the way you held things that were too good to be casual about. The anniversary fell on a Friday, October the following year. 12 months since a rain-soaked evening on Michigan Avenue, a blind date that had lasted 40 seconds, a word spoken at a table for 2 that had rearranged everything. Nolan made the reservation. He didn't tell her where until the afternoon, when he texted, "Wear something you like. I'll pick you up at 7. She was at ClearPath until 6:30, wrapping a product meeting that had run 20 minutes over. She went home, changed into the green dress, the same one she'd worn that night, because some things deserved the full circle, and was ready when his car pulled up at 7:04, which was within acceptable parameters. He was waiting outside, leaning against the car in the evening cool, his coat open because he was perpetually underdressed for October. He looked at her when she came through the lobby door, and the expression on his face was the unguarded one, the one underneath the composure. "Green," he said. "I thought it was appropriate." "It is." He opened the car door. "Yo, you look good, Brielle." "You say that like you're noting a weather condition." "I say it like I mean it." He closed the door after her. She looked at him through the window as he walked around to the driver's side, and she thought about the same door, a year ago, opening onto the rain. She thought about the version of herself who had stood outside Aurelius in the green dress and stared at her own reflection and braced for what was coming. She thought, she didn't know yet, but she was about to. Yeah. Aurelius was exactly as it had always been. Amber-lit, warm, the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out onto Michigan Avenue, the city moving beyond the glass. The same hostess, the same bread, the same music underneath the murmur of a Friday night room. They were seated by the window, the same table. Brielle sat down and looked out at the city lights blurred soft and watercolor through the glass, and 12 months collapsed into a single instant. The woman alone, reaching for her purse, the word from the table beside hers, and then expanded back out into everything that had happened in between. "You reserved the same table," she said. "I asked specifically," Nolan said. "They remembered me. The hostess said I was the man who sat there with his daughter and talked to the woman who stayed." She looked at him. "She said that?" "Word for word." He settled into his chair. "I think it made an impression. They ordered, they ate. They talked the way they talk now. Not carefully, not performing, not managing how they were received." About the West Loop firm and the transit bridge project that had become his primary focus, a pedestrian bridge over the Chicago River that would take 3 years to build, and that he described with the contained excitement of someone trying not to be embarrassingly enthusiastic and losing the battle slightly. About the tiered access rollout and the rural clinic partnerships that ClearPath had been building since May, the work that felt most directly like the reason she'd built the company in the first place. About Sadie, who had begun 3rd grade with a focus on, to no one's surprise, mathematics and structural drawing, and whose teacher had called Nolan in the 2nd week to say she was either exceptionally gifted or running another long-term experiment, possibly both. "She wants to be an engineer," Nolan said. "She's already an engineer," Brielle said. "She's just waiting for the credentials." He smiled at that. "She told me she wants to build hospitals with roof gardens." Brielle set her fork down. "She said that?" 2 weeks ago. She said, and I quote, "The hospital should be for everyone, and it should be beautiful, because being sick is already bad enough." Brielle was quiet for a moment. She thought about a cardboard hospital on a kitchen table in February, built by a child who had been paying attention in a waiting room somewhere and decided to keep what she'd learned. "She's going to be extraordinary," Brielle said. "She already is," Nolan said. The exact mirror of what she'd thought herself 2 months ago in the kitchen. They'd been doing this more lately, finishing the other's thoughts, arriving at the same place from different angles, the particular synchrony of two people who had learned each other well enough to think in some of the same directions. She noticed it. She let herself notice it, which was itself a change from the woman she'd been a year ago, who would have kept the noticing at a careful distance from anything that felt like certainty. She wasn't keeping things at careful distances anymore. It was still her instinct sometimes. She still caught herself bracing, still felt the old reflex of preparation for the shoe that didn't drop. But she caught it more quickly now, and she put it down more easily, and the time between the brace and the release was getting shorter. Carol had said, in their April session, "You're learning to live in the present tense." She'd said, "That sounds so simple when you say it like that." Carol had said, "Most true things do." What? The dessert had come and gone, and the room had thinned into its later, quieter Friday rhythm when Nolan reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table beside her plate. A small box, dark velvet, the kind that meant exactly one thing. He left it there. Didn't open it, just set it down and looked at her. Brielle looked at the box. She looked at him. Her heart was doing something she was not going to try to describe because she was 31 years old and a tech entrepreneur who had faced down a securities fraud case and a hostile board maneuver and several 100,000 comment sections, and she was not going to be the person who couldn't name what her own heart was doing. She was terrified. She was more certain than she had ever been about anything. Both things were true simultaneously. This was, she understood, what it felt like when something was real. I'm not going to make a speech, Nolan said. You know I'm bad at speeches. You're not bad at them. You just don't like them. Same result. He looked at her steadily. I've been thinking about what to say for 3 months. Every version I came up with sounded like someone trying to sound like themselves, which is never the same as actually being yourself. He paused. So I'm just going to say the thing. Okay, she said. Her voice was mostly even. You came back for me, he said. That first night, you stayed because I asked you to. But everything after that, you came back. Every time something tried to make it not worth it, you came back. You sat in a courthouse hallway for 2 hours for my kid. You put your hand on my back on a bench and didn't say anything, which was exactly the right thing, and I've thought about that moment more than I can explain. He held her gaze. I asked you to stay once. You've been choosing to stay every day since. I don't have a word for what that is to me. I just know I want to be in the room where that keeps happening. I want to be the person you keep choosing. He opened the box. The ring was simple. A single stone, well cut, set low. The kind of ring made for a person who worked with their hands, which she didn't particularly, but which said something about the man who'd chosen it, that he'd thought about practicality and longevity and the kind of thing that would be worn rather than displayed. She looked at it for a moment. She looked at him. Remember the word you said that night? He asked. Low, quiet. She laughed. It came out slightly fractured, the way laughs did when they were competing with something else for the same space. You're using that right now. Is it working? Nolan. Yeah? She looked at the ring. She looked at the man who had sat at the table beside hers on a rain-soaked Friday and said a word he'd been carrying for 4 years and had given her without knowing, yet who she was, or what it would mean, or where it would take them. She thought about all the ways she'd tried to give him reasons to reconsider. The tabloids, the board meeting, the noise, the press, the woman who'd said you deserve someone better in the cold outside a ballroom and meant it, had believed it completely in that moment, had been so convinced of her own insufficiency that she'd tried to give him an exit he'd refused to take. He'd refused every single time. Not because he hadn't seen it clearly. Nolan Hart saw things clearly. It was the most consistent thing about him, the most reliable. He'd seen her clearly from the beginning. Not the company, not the public profile, not the tabloid version or the boardroom version. Her. Imperfect and defended and slowly, imperfectly, learning how to live without bracing for the shoe. He'd seen her and stayed. Yes, she said. The word came out clean and complete, the way it should, the way it had always been going to. He took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger, and his hands were steady, which was something she noticed. That he wasn't shaking, not because he wasn't feeling it, but because this was Nolan, who stayed steady in the things that mattered and let himself feel them at full depth without letting that depth destabilize him. She'd been learning from that for a year. Around them, the room had gone slightly quiet in the way rooms did when something happened that everyone peripherally registered. A few nearby tables, the couple to their left, the group of 4 who'd been celebrating something of their own for the last hour. Someone started applause, small and genuine, and it moved through the room the way these things did, building not into anything performative, but into something warm, the sound of a room of strangers deciding to be glad for someone. Brielle looked at the ring on her hand. She looked at the man across from her. She looked out through the rain-streaked glass at the city lights blurred soft and moving in the October wet. The same lights that had been there a year ago, the same glass, the same city doing what cities did, holding everyone's ordinary and extraordinary moments simultaneously, all of it happening at once, none of it diminished by the rest of it. Last year, she said, I was sitting at this table trying not to cry. I know, he said, and then you said one word. And you stayed. And I stayed. She looked at him. You knew, didn't you, when you said it? You knew it was going to be something. He considered this with the honesty he brought to most things. I knew it was the right thing to say, he said. I knew the moment was one of those moments where the right thing had to be said, or it would just be lost. One of those moments where someone's alone in something they shouldn't be alone in. He paused. I didn't know it was going to be a year. I didn't know it was going to be a ring. He looked at her steadily. I knew I didn't want you to leave. She thought about everything between that word and this one. About the blue kitchen and the custody hearing and the community center and Destiny asleep against her arm. About the boardroom and the courthouse hallway and the cardboard hospital and the drawings on a kitchen table. About Carol's office and the gray garden and the question she'd finally been able to answer. About Terrell in their mother's kitchen saying, "Are you letting him in? Actually in." About the green dress and the rain and the particular courage it took to sit back down. She thought about Elena, who had known her husband well enough to send a promise forward through time, wrapped inside a word simple enough to be said in a restaurant, significant enough to rearrange a life. When life tells someone they're unworthy of love, be the person who stays. She had been told that so many times, in so many ways, by so many rooms and glances and disappeared smiles and comment sections. She had believed it long enough that she'd built her whole architecture around the belief. The competence, the control, the careful management of how she was perceived, the pre-bracing for every exit. And then someone had said stay, and she had. And over the course of a year, she had discovered that the belief was wrong. Not in a dramatic instant, not all at once. Slowly, in the blue kitchen and the courthouse hallway, in therapy and in Sadie's drawings, and in the hand placed steadily on a bench without a word, in a 7-legged horse and a 4-legged horse and a cardboard hospital with a roof garden, she had discovered piece by piece that she had been wrong about herself for a very long time. That was the thing nobody told you about being loved correctly. It didn't fix you. It didn't fill a hole or heal a wound or complete some missing part. What it did was quieter and harder and more useful. It showed you, slowly by example, what it looked like to be seen accurately. And being seen accurately, over time, made it harder to believe the inaccurate version. Not impossible, not without effort, but harder. She was still learning it. She would probably always be learning it. The old reflex would catch her sometimes. She'd brace, she'd feel the weight of a look or a comment or a slow news week, and for a moment the old architecture would reassert itself, the familiar prepared for exit posture. And then she would remember the word, or the ring on her hand, or the way Sadie had told her, without ceremony, that she was already fast enough. And she would put it down. They were still at the table at 10:30, which was later than either of them usually stayed anywhere on a Friday, given that Saturday mornings at the community center didn't adjust for late nights. The room had mostly emptied. Their waiter, young, patient, had refreshed their water 4 times without being asked, came by to ask if there was anything else. And Nolan said just the check. And the young man looked at the ring on Brielle's hand and at the two of them and said congratulations with the simple warmth of someone who meant it. And Brielle said thank you in the way she said things now, which was more open than she used to be, more willing to receive what was offered without immediately calculating what it cost. Outside, the rain had stopped. The October air was cold and clean, the kind of clean that rain left behind, and the city lights were sharp without the blur of wet glass between them. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not hailing a car yet, just standing in the evening, in the specific quiet of people who don't need to fill the moment. Sadie's going to be impossible tomorrow, Nolan said. Why? Because Mrs. Okafor is going to tell her the second we pick her up, and Sadie has been waiting for this to happen since approximately February. Brielle looked at him. She knew? She told me in March that I should ask you before she graduated 3rd grade because she wanted you at the celebration. He paused. She said, and this is exact. Don't wait too long, Dad. She already said yes in her head. Brielle stood on the sidewalk in the October cold and thought about a child who had been paying attention all along, who had watched the two of them with the focused, honest assessment she brought to everything, and had simply concluded what the evidence supported. She's not wrong, Brielle said. She never is, Nolan said. It's exhausting. She laughed, and he smiled at the laugh, and they stood there another moment in the quiet. She thought about what she would tell people someday when they asked about the beginning. She'd been asked already. Maya, her mother, Terrell, board members who'd heard it secondhand, journalists who were still trying to write the story as something simpler than it was. They always wanted the neat version, the before and after, the moment everything changed. She understood the impulse. She'd looked for it herself, early on. The clean dividing line, the single thing you could point to and say there, that's when. But that wasn't how it worked. It never was. There had been a word, and then there had been a year of choosing to sit back down, and then choosing to come back, and then choosing to stay in the difficult parts, when the difficult parts were trying to make it not worth it. The word had been the door. Everything after had been the walking through it, one imperfect, ordinary, necessary day at a time. That was the thing about love that nobody wanted to say plainly because it sounded small and the feeling didn't feel small. It was mostly just showing up, not dramatically, not heroically, just persistently. Just being the person who stayed in the room when the room got hard, who didn't make the exit that was being offered, who looked at another person with their full, imperfect reality on display and decided, still you, still here. Brielle Mercer had spent 30 years being told, in 100 different ways, that she was not the kind of person who got that, not the kind who deserved the word, not the kind who got to sit at the table without bracing for what was coming. She'd been wrong. She was learning every day exactly how wrong she'd been. The ring on her finger caught the streetlight. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at the man beside her. This stubborn, honest, imperfect man who had fixed a cabinet hinge in a blue kitchen and talked about bridges with a retired judge and held a sleeping child against his shoulder and answered Warren Holt with 3 words in a ballroom and sat on a courthouse bench and let her hand rest on his back. And she felt the thing she'd been learning to feel without flinching. Safe. Not because nothing could hurt her, not because the world had changed its mind about her, because there was someone beside her who knew exactly who she was and had not moved. Ready? Nolan asked. She looked at the city. Chicago on a Friday in October, lit and wet and moving, full of its own complicated, beautiful, ordinary life. Full of tables for 2 and rooms full of strangers and words said in passing that changed everything, and words never said that should have been, and all the 1,000 small moments that a life was actually made of, none of them quite as neat as anyone planned them, all of them adding up to something. Yes, she said. They walked. The city moved around them the way cities always did. Indifferent and alive, the great ongoing hum of everything happening at once. 2 people on a sidewalk in October, one of them learning for the first time in her life to walk without bracing. One of them keeping a promise that had carried him 4 years and brought him here. Neither of them looked back at the restaurant window. There was nothing back there they needed to see. Everything that mattered was in front of them. There is something this story is really about, underneath the gala and the courtroom and the tabloids and the fraud case. It's about the moment before the door, the moment when someone has decided they are not enough, not worthy, not the kind of person who gets the table at the end of the night. The moment when years of small cruelties have added up into a weight so familiar that you've stopped noticing you're carrying it. You've just organized your whole life around it. You've built your empire around it. You've learned to call it strength. And then someone says one word. Not a speech, not a grand gesture, just stay. Just, you are worth the next 5 minutes of this evening. Just, I see you and I'm not leaving. The word is not magic. The word is not a cure. What follows the word is a year of ordinary days, most of them unglamorous, some of them genuinely hard. Boardrooms and courtrooms and tabloids and late nights and a child's custody battle and a man who hadn't been doing what he loved for 3 years because he'd reorganized everything around what mattered more. What follows the word is 2 people, both of them imperfect, both of them carrying things, learning how to carry them together rather than separately in the same vicinity. That is not a love story in the way love stories are usually told. There is no single scene where everything is fixed. There is no moment where the wound closes cleanly. There is just showing up, staying, choosing again the next day and the next. If you have been told, by a room, by a face, by the particular silence after something was said in front of people who should have objected, that you are not enough, that you are not the kind of person who gets to sit at the table, that the ones who stay must be getting something from it, something other than you. This is not about that being easy to unbelieve. It isn't easy. It may be the hardest work there is, but somewhere in a restaurant, in a kitchen, in a courthouse hallway, in the ordinary middle of an ordinary day, there is a person who will look at you and not look away, who will say, in some form, stay, who will mean it all the way down, And the question, when that happens, is not whether you deserve it. The question is whether you are brave enough to sit back down, stay.